We're in Sarasota, Florida. And
Awesome.
we are live.
The same state.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Podcast number 78. We're going to be hitting on a spicy topic today on why you should wait till marriage for sex.
Oof. Yeah,
And,
blue balls
this-
just thinking about it. Yeah, buddy. Those
This
things
is,
are perma blue.
You know, like I kind of wrote, like, I think Christians virtue signal this topic all the time, but then don't actually live it. So we're going to talk about actually making it happen, actually living it, not
Yeah,
just
how many
talking
people
about
do
it.
we know that actually lived it?
It's rare.
No one's even going to tell you the truth. Even,
Yeah.
I mean, if they did, you'd just be like,
Or they
yeah,
broke
probably.
every possible rule except, like, technically we didn't do what
Yeah, Catholic girls rule.
Yeah, they broke every
Felicia,
possible
yeah.
rule. But today we got a special guest here, Rob Kowalski. He's actually down in Florida as well, visiting Key West, and so he's in the Sunshine State. But Rob, why don't you tell our guests kind of just a little bit what you're about and kind of your background into why this topic is kind of on your heart.
Sure, man. Thanks for having me on. Discovered you guys recently. Love what you're putting out there. My name's Rob Kowalski. I was born and raised in Baltimore. I refer to myself as a reformed bad boy because I was, before meeting the Lord, I was the biggest man whore in my city. I was a stripper in my 20s. I was in the phone book. I worked for all the entertainment agencies. And you guys still there?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Full screen,
Full
man.
screen.
We full screened you. You're good.
So, oh yeah, I slept with, I don't want to talk numbers, but it was a lot of women, a lot of one night stands. And, my relationships were always chaotic with women. And I did have some, if you want to call them monogamous relationships, one that even lasted 5 years, but I would, was cheating on her pretty much every chance I could get. And I got to the point where I just kind of thought that I wasn't the kind of guy that could be monogamous or I guess I would say that maybe I didn't think that I was capable of love. And I met the Lord when I was 27. I got this radical encounter with Jesus. I got baptized in the Holy Spirit. I prophesied. And essentially God told me, like, if you do relationships my way, you'll be able to find love. It pretty much is what he told me. And I believed him, and I kind of stopped, and I assumed that he was going to give me a wife, which I didn't even really. A wife wasn't the goal. I never really wanted to get married, nor did I even believe in love, I guess. So I was 27 at the time, so I was fairly young, and but I knew what I was signing up for and being a Christian, and I was believe what the Bible said, so I was going to try to do everything that it said, and I committed myself to wait for this woman that I thought he would give me with enough good behavior. And it turned into 6 years of abstinence. And it was very difficult, because I was very sexually active before, always had a girl around, was never alone at all. Even if I was single, I always had a girl there. So it was definitely challenging and emotional roller coaster. And after 6 years of abstinence, I backslid, and I had a bunch more sexual sin, rededicated my life 12 years ago to God. And somewhere along the way, I guess, of waiting, or of being so promiscuous and then waiting and then falling off and then recommitting again, I just kind of felt like I had a very good understanding of sex and the practicality of waiting, and why I kept getting into these bad relationships where it wasn't necessarily me, or it wasn't or them. It was just the fact that I, wasn't committed to saving sex for marriage. Therefore, I wasn't really screening girls with any level of anything except for physical attraction, because I knew we were going to have sex sooner or later. So I wasn't really asking myself, like, is she wife material? Because I wasn't even thinking about that. So that's just one part of the argument. But after kind of coming to this understanding, I got passionate about sharing it with people, because when I first became a Christian, I didn't understand why sex before marriage was a sin. To me, it was like a massage. We're two people making each other feel good. Why would we wait? In fact, if a girl made me wait, I actually thought it was kind of manipulative, and I didn't, understand why she would even do that. So once I did have this understanding, I made a YouTube video called 10 Reasons Not to Have Sex Before Marriage, posted it on YouTube, and it went viral. It ended up right around 2 million views, I think, and became for a while, it was the #1 video on that topic on YouTube, I believe. And started getting people reach out to me. I decided I was going to write a book. I wrote a book called Why Waiting Works, just breaking down the practical benefits of saving sex for marriage. Now, this was when I wrote the book. This was at least 5 or 6 years ago, and I didn't assume that I'd be single still. Now, all this time later, I do believe, in sexual purity and sex outside of marriage is a sin, but it's definitely the hard road for sure. It's not the easy way to do it. I think you avoid a lot of pain by doing it and causing other people pain, but it certainly there's a cost to it too.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think that's just the reality of the Christian life. It's not meant to be easy. It's everything we do is going to be harder than, going with the flow of culture and, choosing, you're delaying gratification, a lot of Christian morals in general. So
it's a good sign. It's indicative.
Yeah.
Are you suffering? Are you getting along with everybody? Are you fitting in great? Probably not walking with Jesus very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think with delayed gratification, that's actually something I reference in the book of, the marshmallow test, that test they did.
Yep.
So I talked about
say it real quick just for people that might not know it.
Yeah, it was a real test they did in the 70s, and they involved children, and this is my friends coming in. They put a little tiny marshmallow in front of these kids, and they said, "Hey, look, don't eat that marshmallow. When I come back, I'll give you 2." And then they would leave the room, and most of the kids ate the marshmallow as soon as the teacher left. But some of the kids waited. And what they found, they followed those kids throughout their lives. And what they found is, as they grew up, they did better in everything across the board. They were better students. They got, they made more money. They were better physical shape. And it was all about delayed gratification because they had it innately. Now, I believe that it's a muscle that can be strengthened. It's not something, that you're born with or you're not. Everyone can delay gratification. But that being said, like at some point you expect the 2 marshmallows, right? You're like, where's my payoff? And that's, for me, like I've gotten to the point where I'm like, what the hell, God, this is ridiculous. Like I've delayed gratification. Where's that second marshmallow? Come on. Not to say that should be our only motivation, because it should just you should be able to get to the point because God said so. I mean, at the end of the day, if there's no payoff, if I die abstinent, I have to be that committed to the point. If I die alone and abstaining and never have sex again for the rest of my life, I have to be okay, because then I have no regrets. Like I get to stand before God and be like, I gave it my all, God.
Exactly.
So
yeah, I feel you, man.
Yeah, I think, but it's a challenge.
Well, it's
right?
kind of like I actually heard Jordan Peterson's doing this Exodus series, and it's really cool because he kind of brings that point up. And he's like, the promise that was given to Moses, the promise that was given to Abraham, they never saw that stuff come to fruition. But, we are eternal beings, so you have to have that kingdom mind. So it's like, yeah, it might not happen. Sex might not happen for me now, but I'm going to have eternity with the Father. So you kind of reorganize what your rewards and expectations end up being. And that is a struggle. But sometimes you're not guaranteed those things in this life. It's just the way it is. Abraham didn't see his sons become like the sands of the sea, but he's alive up there. So he did see it eventually, just not here on this planet.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So what are some okay, go ahead.
No, it's just trying to see this life from an eternal perspective. That is the challenge, right?
Yeah.
We're trapped in these human bodies, and like we want the payoff.
Yeah, definitely. We want to chase dopamine.
Hey, that's why fellowship is so important, because we remind each other as warriors together in this battle what is of importance, what is the cost of discipleship, what is the cost of grace and salvation, what Christ did for us, and what we're gonna what is true success in life. Yeah, you remind each other all the time. That's why you need. And brothers. You're going to be here to remind us today, of like you've been abstinent and been faithful with something, and some people think it's a big deal to go without sex or masturbating or any of those things, just getting your rocks off, period, for a year, let alone 6 or however long you've been going. So it's clearly given you've written a book, you're trying to explain to people that this waiting thing, the reason why the Bible tells us to wait for our mate, for our wife, or our husband, has significance, real significance. And I heard earlier in our pre-discussion that there is some scientific stuff that backs actually this our command up.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a different argument or conversation that you have to have with men and women, because women intuitively know saving sex for marriage is something that they should do. They catch feelings a lot easier than men and get their heart broke after sex. And, if they get kicked around a few times, they kind of learn that they shouldn't give it out so quickly. For men, it's a little bit different. One of the main ways it would backfire on me is I would have sex with a girl, and normally, like most of the time, I would lose any feeling or interest I had in her the moment I ejaculated. And sometimes there'd be a girl and we would continue sleeping together for a length of time. And then it got to be around, let's say, the third month. And I couldn't play the non-committal game anymore. She was going to dip and probably go sleep with somebody else. And I didn't want that to happen because I felt a little territorial over at that point, but I still was wanting my freedom. So I'd make her my girlfriend because I couldn't play that game anymore. And then I'd be in this relationship, looking over my shoulder at the next one, wondering if I could be happier with her, but also not all that physically attractive to this beautiful girl laying next to me. And I feel like most people have heard the saying, "Show me the best beautiful girl in the world, and I'll show you a guy that's tired of with her." And that's 100% true. And that way it backfires on men, because I don't care how good she looks. I literally would date girls that were, I wouldn't have changed anything. And I just wanted to go to sleep. Because we didn't have that deep connection. And I really believe that if you lead with physical attraction and sex, you'll end up having less sex in the long run than the person that's
great point. In terms of what qualifies good sex, it's not always that sexual attraction, that initial sort of sparky, what people call chemistry, or that aesthetic, like, ooh, I gotta have that, right? We have a good friend, Will. He does the Renaissance of men, and he says it like this: it's thrilling but not fulfilling.
Yeah, dude, he has those good little
So you got to keep up on it. You're never fulfilled.
That's a good one.
Thanks for bringing that up again. Love that. That's good. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's man. It's with any sin, it's fun while you're doing it, and then it leaves you empty. And whereas the opposite with righteousness or being obedient to God is kind of the opposite, where it's not fun while you're doing it a lot of times. But afterward, it gives you some kind of positive feeling. If you're volunteering, let's say, if you're out building a house for somebody, it might not be, it's probably hard work in the moment, but then later you feel really good about yourself and you feel fulfilled. Yeah. Like for me, I know when I was touring around, I would look in the mirror on Mondays after the week passed, and I didn't like who I saw looking back. I felt like shit about myself, excuse my language, but I just felt like a disappointment to God. I felt like I had negative thoughts about myself. I felt like other people probably had negative thoughts about me. And
just real quick, I got a question about that, because there's a lot of pushback in the secular societies. They're like, oh, you grew up in a Christian household, so that's been inculcated or, like kind of forced into you. You've been, conditioned to have the response of shame and guilt. Was that the case for you? I disagree with that. I don't care where you come from. But did you grow up in a Christian household, or were you?
So my uncle was a strong Christian, and he put me in Christian school probably 4 out of the 2 years. I got expelled from 2 other Christian schools. My mom was 14 when she got pregnant with me, and my dad was never in the same state as me. So I didn't have like a real strong male role model around. And so whatever I was learning in school or occasionally in church wasn't being backed up at home. So not really. I never really felt God's presence or heard his voice until that time I told you about 23 years ago when I got baptized in the Spirit. So no, it wasn't, and prior to that moment of me really giving my heart to the Lord, I had no conscience. Like when I was out sleeping with girls, I never felt guilty about anything I did. But after becoming a Christian, it definitely felt different. I've heard people say Jesus ruined your fun. You can't sin anymore. You can't do the things you were doing prior to meeting the Lord and feel the same way about him. I don't think it's possible unless you really seared your conscience.
Yeah.
Do you think that like endless chase of women, a lot of that is just seeking your own validation?
I don't know where it stems from. I think I've had people talk to me and say, I wasn't shown a lot of me and my mom's relationship. We didn't have like a lot of deep talks and intimacy. Like it wasn't, that. And maybe I was out seeking attention from females to try to fulfill something that wasn't there. I don't know. I never thought about that when I was doing it. I thought I was girl crazy. But I wouldn't doubt that there's something there, some brokenness.
Do you mind telling me, because I was excited and just to hear, because I want to learn about what this research is, that because you start off by saying for women it's a whole lot more instinctual to hold marriage in a higher regard, whereas men it's not. So it sounds like you have some information to try and let these guys know that yes, it is indeed important for men on the scientific, more secular domain of knowledge. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. I mean, the reasons, and I don't know if I remember them all. Let me see if I can remember them all. One was sex and mass problems, because, you know, when you're having sex in a relationship, you're not evaluating on the level that you would if you're not having sex. And I can tell you this from firsthand experience. When I backslid, and I, you know, before I rededicated my life to God 12 years ago, I had a girlfriend. We were having sex, and I rededicated my life to God, and I was going to continue just having sex with her, to be honest, and thinking I'm just not going to sleep with anybody but her. I'm going to be, you know, that's good enough. We're in a committed relationship. But God started convicting me. He was really clear about it too. I could tell you, actually, I'll tell you the story. It was kind of funny. We were fooling around one day. We were about to have sex, and I said, "Hold on a second, let me put music on." I went over, I grabbed her remote, and in Maryland, in Baltimore, everything above 400 on cable is music station. So I grabbed the remote. I hit 411 because it was the fastest numbers I could hit. 1-1, right? Because I wanted to get to it. And the first song, first it was gospel. First song station comes up gospel. I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. I grabbed the remote. I went down one station, and the very first lyrics on the song, it was old school R&B, and I'll never forget it. It said, "Temptation's gonna get me every time." That was the very first lyrics I heard. I was like, oh my gosh. And I already knew God was telling me to stop, and I was trying to pretend like I didn't. And this is before I
experiences where it feels like God has got your back, and the Holy Spirit's like right there. You're like, oh yeah, there is a team effort afoot to keep this from going down. You will not enjoy this experience.
Yeah, you're gonna love it.
To be honest, we probably still did it, but I had a very honest conversation with God after that. And I said, look, I'm going to try to do this your way. And if I'm in love with this girl, convince me and I'll marry her. I said, but if I'm not in love with her, convince me that and help us break up. Because her and I had broken up about 10 times.
Ooh, that sounds like a
roller coaster. We'd break up. 2 weeks later, we'd have sex, make up sex together. And this lasted for about a year and a half. And this is before I knew about the book or the YouTube video or City Fam, all my proudest accomplishments, which all revolved around saving sex for marriage. So I didn't know about that. this was in God's plans. All I knew was he was telling me to stop having sex with my hot girlfriend. So I was like, all right, have this conversation with God. I tell my girlfriend, I said, look, I'm not sure if we're built to last, but here's how we're gonna find out. We're gonna stop having sex. I said, if we become convinced we're in love, we'll get married. But if we can become convinced that we're not in love, let's stop wasting each other's time. So we cut it off. And within about 3 weeks, it was like clarity. The clouds parted, and we both knew we were in love, and we broke up. And she literally got pregnant by like her neighbor about a month later, and now she lives in Florida, actually. So God completely answered. But I think what the sex does is it masks the real problems. When you stop having it, because here's the way our body's wired. You want sex. I want sex. You want sex. It's like, it'd be like me coming over your house if I was starving to death. I'd be like, bro, are we going to go eat or not? Because if you and I aren't going to go eat, I'm going to go find somebody to eat with, right? Like that's basically what you're saying. But when you're having sex, you're meeting each other's basic physical needs, and you're not really forced to evaluate anything. You might wonder, am I in love? I don't know. But then you just continue on in the relationship because you're not forced to look in the way that you are when you stop, because my body wants it again. So that's what I encourage anybody out there to do, even men or women, if they made the mistake, don't think that it's too late. If you're in a physical relationship, especially women, because a lot of times they want to get married. I'm like, you got to force, either way you win. You say, look, we're not going to have sex again till our wedding. And you're going to find out he's a joker, wasting your time, and he'll leave in that case you win, or he's going to man up and marry you. Now, I know it's a lot of guys that follow you, and marriage isn't necessarily a goal for a lot of men these days. A lot of guys don't even want to get married because they don't want to get trapped. And I guess I kind of understand that. But, what I would say to those guys is, man, if you look at the world right now, like Jesus is coming back soon. And I would want to be as close to him as possible, and the Bible's pretty clear about fornicators don't inherit the kingdom. Like that's been a big motivator for me to not do the things, so it's not just what I'm going to get on this earth. Part of it is I'm going to be obedient because I feel like I'm going to see him soon. And I don't want,
Yeah, that definitely, I agree with that. And I look at relationships a lot, like what you said, is these relationships that are breaking up and getting back together all the time. I just assume it's like, this is because sex, they're still attached to each other, when if they weren't doing that, I kind of like, I want to know if that ever happens with relationships that are abstinent? Do they play this game of always going back and forth on? I kind of doubt it,
Mm.
because you're way
Certainly
more.
don't hear the stories.
No, you're way more rational, I think.
Because there's none of them in existence.
That's true.
The
That's
breakups
true.
are a lot more painful too in your physical.
Yeah,
Oh,
The soul tie thing's real. Pair bonding,
Yeah.
if you want to call it that.
Do you want to talk about that? I heard Mike hint about something about the Bible talks about one flesh happening when you consummate a marriage. There's the sex thing that happens. There's a real implication spiritually that occurs. The Bible tells us that. But scientifically, is there anything that happens with the two bodies that we don't know about? Is there something genetically speaking that happens?
For sure, there is. Actually, I had Dawn Mazur. She endorsed my book, and she did a really fascinating TED talk called "How Your Brain Falls in Love," and it talks about sex nexus. And for women, during orgasm, they have this big oxytocin release, and oxytocin is like glue. It's really kind of a bonding hormone. And if you think about like what the Bible said about, two people will cleave, it sounds a lot like oxytocin when you look into it. The thing is, though, is men don't have oxytocin release when they have sex. We have an oxytocin release when we commit, and that's what she found when she studied the human brain, which is kind of, to me, proves that God knew what he was talking about, because women are the gatekeepers of sex. So if they were, if we did it God's way, a woman essentially on her wedding night says, she gives her body, and the man gives his last name, security, he commits, and then two people cleave together, and they become that unit that can withstand all the storms of life and raise a family, for example. And the problem is for me, is I would have all these one night stands, and I would sleep with a girl, and as soon as I came, I would be like ready to go out the door, and I didn't want to be around him. I didn't want him to spend the night. Probably didn't want to see him again, in all honesty. And I might have liked him up until this moment. And what she said is almost like it's this buildup in our brain. It's almost like a roller coaster. It has to build over time. And then when you find, if you consummate, if it's after a certain amount of time, you have this release. But if you don't give that time to build, you don't get the release of this oxytocin from a male standpoint. So I would say, what was that question again? I'm sorry, I got off track.
Just the scientific, so for instance, the pair bonding thing that you described, this is a real phenomenon that occurs. And I like what you brought up earlier in Proverbs, like you can sear your conscience. So a lot of times you'll hear arguments from people with seared conscience. So like Adam 22, who has an open relationship and his wife is banging people and he's banging people. And they're like, everything's okay, but it's a very subjective approach to okay. What does okay mean? Their pair bonding mechanisms have largely diluted into just taking something sacred and having a very they've diluted it, so it's not sacred anymore. And so then they say, well, pair bonding is not important, or they don't understand concepts like pair bonding from a scientific place of like these things are actually occurring. And when you wreck them over and over again, there's scar tissue that occurs, spiritually speaking. You have the scar tissue, which is your seared conscience. So you no longer see it as a problem. It's like Proverbs when it says a man's way seems right to him in his mind. God's like, I will leave you to your own devices. And then you can sort of rationalize and talk your way out of it being wrong or right at that point, because, you've done the damage.
Yeah. It is a different conversation for men and women. I'd love for us to just discuss it, because for women, they have a lot different of consequences from having casual sex. There's studies out there that women that have had 10 or more sex partners have the highest divorce rates. And so to me, that proves pair bonding is a real thing. Like a woman's going to more than likely fall in love with the first or second guy that she has sex with. And it's, imagine if she releases oxytocin and she cleaves to this man, and then she pulls away, and then she does it again. She pulls away, and she does it again. She pulls away. Eventually, like, you're not so sticky anymore. And I do think that sex is a connection mechanism, especially for women, and you can break it when you treat it like recreation. I don't know that it's the same for men, and that's the hard part, because like, how do you convince a Christian man that you should be abstinent? And for me, it goes back to the obedience, because I do believe we're living in the end times. I feel like those signs are all around, and just you should just do it because God said so, as hard as it is. In addition to the fact that it goes back to the whole, like, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And if you are having sex with a girl that outside of marriage, there's probably a good chance that she's someone else's future wife.
Very good point.
You know, so that's not loving your neighbor as you love yourself, obviously. That's being,
I think you know, one of the comments I saw on a reel we posted recently was this guy trying to say that sex is basically equivalent to taking a piss for a man. He's parroting Myron Gaines from Fresh and Fit, because he always says that. And I'm kind of curious what you think about that statement in general, because that's where a lot of men are going to say, well, I don't have this emotional attachment problem that women have with it. So like, and then, you know, they'll pull up, you know, some studies, which others don't show this, but that sex partners don't correlate really with divorce with men or marital happiness with men. So yeah, I'm curious what you think on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I completely disagree. I think about like if a man was to go see a sex worker or go to a rub and tug, he doesn't have any emotional connection to that person. It's strictly physical to him, but it's still sin, right? It's still sin. It's lust in God's eyes. That, you know, that person that's doing it is still a child of God, someone's daughter or sister or mother or whatever. So it's sin. But I don't think you can deny the fact that it's different for men. Men can have sex without emotion, women not so much. It doesn't make it right. I do think there's truth there. I mean, even the Bible, when it talks about premarital sex, like in the Old Testament, it was like, if a woman's found not to be a virgin on her wedding night, take her to the door of her father's house and stone her to death. If a man sleeps with a woman, he says if he seduces a virgin to be his wife, he has to pay the bride price. You got to marry her. Now she's yours. Like, and that, so it really does go back to the whole sex and security. Men want sex, women want security. We're the gatekeepers of the security. They're the gatekeepers of sex. I think, so to convince a man to not take sex when he knows he doesn't even have to give the security, which means responsibility, it's hard as a non-Christian to convince that man not to.
Oh, you're never
as
going
a
to on that.
non-Christian? Yeah.
As a Christian, it's a non-argument. It's in the Bible. I mean, it's a sin. I mean, is it going to affect you the same way? Are you going to have a higher chance of divorce? Maybe not, but you are going to be held accountable for that someday.
Do you think though, like the one thing, like as someone who's gone through a bunch of women like yourself, as far as taking your brain and turning off that variety programming, like I've always thought, like, how these guys that go through 100 women and then get married to one turn off that variety need?
Yeah, that's
like, I would assume that the results can't be great on that, and they're getting it somehow.
Now, and they say comparison's the thief of joy, right? Like, so like you do have that. You have that comparison because if you slept with a bunch of women and trying to settle down with one can be really challenging. For me, I haven't even had one, and it's not been fun. It's been lonely and depressing at times. I've definitely paid the price for the way I lived. You know, God put me through a long wilderness season. So had I never done it, yeah, absolutely. I think it's better never to go to that height than to have to go to that height and then come back down and live at, you know, try to find happiness in just normal things that maybe brought me happiness before. So I think you can jam yourself up that way for sure.
It reminds me of like heroin addicts.
Yeah.
And I think it happens with meth as well. Like once you reach that threshold of dopamine, it's like all the other little things, the color of life's just kind of drawn out. You don't get the normal good feelings you would get from a morning walk. You know, you don't hear the birds singing. You don't look at the beautiful sky and go, man, that's gorgeous. You know, you don't see these things. You know, they don't hit you the way that they should.
So true, man. It's like you're jaded.
Even the family stuff too. Like for me, I'm 50 now, never been married, never been in love, no kids. And I have a lot of friends. I see their pictures on social media. They're always out with their children and sometimes their grandchildren now doing things. And it gives you that pattern, that rhythm of life, birthday parties and all the things, the kids' games. And I don't have those things, you know? So being a player.
They seem lame when you're young, right? You look at that stuff and you're like, oh God, who wants that kind of burden? It's like doing homework. But as you get older, you start to see, like Joe was saying, the beauty in it, the rich gift that it is to have family and fellowship and see others grow and be a father and lead and have this wonderful responsibility that enriches your life.
And not to make you feel bad or anything, but that's what the young guys miss out on, right? We're not selling that or making it cool.
Well, that's the warning to them. Like,
right.
Especially with a lot of the secular talk, like, you know, you gotta like this is the crazy red pill. Some of those guys saying like you got to rack up a 50 body count before you get married.
You got to sear your conscience so horribly.
And it's like, okay, so how, you know,
it reminds me of those people like you have to go into debt to be rich. Like eventually, it's like that same type of advice. It's like not necessarily, but this whole topic, what we're kind of like, you know, talking around it is that delayed gratification, which you brought up, and living a Christ-like life, a life of discipleship, and a life of suffering, and what that means within its agency is that a lot of the most quality events and things that you will do in life, you probably will not feel that dopamine kick while you are doing them. They will be delayed sometimes until death.
Right.
And that's the idea within even having kids. Like you saw your friends while you're out there at the club having drinks and having a great time, and they're over there at home having kid time. You know, maybe the kid's 1 or 2 years old and vomited sick and like they're not getting sleep, and you're like, wow, thank God that is not me.
Right.
But now in your older age, you're like, I don't have a legacy. I don't have my family. I don't have these deep bonds and this like you feel like that.
You have a 50 body count, bro, though.
That's what you got. And then everybody else has
how's that body count treating you now?
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it was a movie
that same game as you grow as a man. It's not something you can.
And when you
playing.
do see the older guys who are still the playboys, and we know a couple, and God bless them, we know we're working on them. It is depressing to see them, you know.
I think it was the movie The Wedding Singer where we talked about, you know, old Fonzie. Nobody wants to see an old Fonzie. Right? Like,
exactly, dude.
It's cool when you're young, you know, at least you think it is. But if I could go back and do things differently, I would get married young. I would get married and I'd have kids. You know, in all honesty, I wouldn't. Because again, it's fun while you're doing it. But then after there's consequences to it. And for me, that's how they played out. I didn't assume that I would be in this place. In all honesty, I didn't think I was going to be this old without a wife. Now I still have options. I keep myself in good shape, and I still have, you know, girls that are interested, thankfully. So I still have hope, you know, and I could probably marry a girl that was in childbearing age and have some kids, but it doesn't change the fact that if I were to have kids, I'm gonna be a grandpa by the time they're in high school. So again, if I could go back and do things.
Well, it's good for guys to hear that. And that's why I think the productivity of you expressing this, not in like well, there is a lamentation. It's real. You know, it's like this time has passed. These seeds have been sown. But to hear that from a guy who's well put together, really is not like them watching their, you know, most typically probably out of shape uncle or whoever family member that's done these things, and they're really not making it look great. You know, and so it's good to hear that side of things described so they can really get the full picture of what they're signing up for when they get their heads in the 50 body count or whatever they're trying to do. So they say, like Jordan Peterson says, who am I going to be 10 years from now? Am I working for that guy or am I working for this guy today? The delayed gratification again.
Let's touch on some of those other points that from your list of 10, kind of the key ones you think are worth mentioning.
Yeah, one of the ones was better to have long-term friends than short-term sex partners. That kind of goes a little bit to what we were just saying, where, you know, I've got a lot of beautiful women in my life that I haven't had sex with over the last, 12 years. And many of them I definitely would have slept with when I was, living in the world. But and they added a lot of value to my life. Starting my nonprofit, there were so many women that were key in helping me get that off the ground. Had I had sex with those girls, I would have traded all that potential, and all that value that they add to my life for 20, 30 minutes of fun. Because that is what happens with sex, regardless of what people say, is somebody catches feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And usually it's the girl. And even if you're honest with them before, which a lot of times I'd be like, look, don't sleep with me because I'm not looking for anything. And they would be like, it's okay, we can just have sex. And then you'd have sex with them. And then as soon as you wanted to have sex with maybe another girl, not them, you were the jerk. Guaranteed. I'm like, I thought we talked about this. It was just the way they're wired. Doesn't matter what you said. So and then you would be the a-hole and they would leave and they wouldn't be your friend anymore. So it's good to have friends. And if you're going to get anywhere in life and really get much accomplished, you're probably going to need people to help you, and women are 50% of the population. In addition to the fact I think that there's something inherent in all of us. If a guy out there sleeping with multiple women, we know that he's flunking up the dating pool for everybody, right? So, and you might kind of look up to him a little bit that he's able to do it, but you might not necessarily like him a lot and be the kind of person that you really want to help. You want to help the nice guy, the person that's a little bit more humble and selfless. And maybe if that's the person you're going to do something for, it would be that kind of person versus the guy that's just going out smashing all the girls. So I feel like that's definitely something that's just really practical. It's better to have long-term friends than it is to burn a relationship with 20 or 30 minutes of fun and just having sex, which I used to do. And it does leave you feeling very empty at the end. You know, like I remember when I was backslidden, I was probably the most popular person in Baltimore at the time. I was kind of like running the nightlife. And I remember being in like a club full of people, and I didn't have any friends there. Like nobody really that knew me or I knew on a deep level. People knew my name, and I knew some of their names, but it was like my life, I was so depressed because it was all so shallow. So, you know, back to what you said, I think that, you know, depth in relationships, like it's not just being known. If it was just a matter of being popular, then celebrities wouldn't be depressed because they're the most popular people in the world. But it's the depth of the relationships, and I think the depth comes from you adding value to people's life and them adding value to yours. So
it's a simple
yeah, go ahead.
It's a simple arithmetic. Sorry, I just wanted to back you up because a lot of people will try and rationalize their way out of things with their ode and, you know, the human your human rights as a person, like you're free. It's like, yeah, you're free, but that's not the whole story, you know. And so yeah, I get it, man, what you're saying. It's true.
What would you tell the, you know, a lot of guys I think come and they hear someone who's in like your case that ran, you know, had a bunch of fun with women and now they're convicted on living a different life, that they're like, well, I'll kind of go through what you did and I'll come to that conviction later when I'm 30 or something, 40. And like, what would you kind of tell those kind of guys?
Yeah, I mean, people say that to me a lot. They used to say, well, yeah, it's easy for you now because you've already had your fun. And I'm like, dude, it's not like that. It's like heroin. It really is. You get an addiction to it. It's not something that you get out of your system. You know, nobody tries heroin to get it out of their system.
Exactly.
So it's better never to try it. Again, kind of going back to what we said, because you take yourself to a place that it's hard to live up to that again. You know, I don't know why I thought of this, but I saw Pauly Shore on the Rogan podcast, and he was talking about, he's like, man, he was just reliving his days. He's like, I just missed it. It was so much fun. And dude, I feel that a lot. You know, to be honest, I look back on those days and I'm like, and it's hard just to be okay with the everyday life. Mm-hmm. So the best thing to do is, it's like Pandora's box, not to even open it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I've explained it as, because I'm still a virgin, as Glenn always loves to bring up on our podcast, and I kind of view it as men in our circumstance. Like, I just know if I open the box, I don't know if I'm going to close it anytime soon, and so I just kind of have that viewpoint as well.
You know what I think helps a lot of the younger guys, and people just with the world we live in, you need to be able to separate performance art, which is from like real, genuine, authentic relationship, like what you were experiencing in the club. You have this performance art. It's an aesthetic you worked hard for. The most popular guy in Baltimore. Everybody knows your name. You go into a place, you're saying hello to so-and-so. There's plans, blah, blah, blah. It's this performance art. It looks like you're performing well, just like the Instagram posts or the TikToks or whatever, but it's not dispelling the authentic relationship that we all know exists. So for a lot of the guys, it's like, yeah, the 50 people, the 50 women on your belt, it's a number, but underneath it, there's baggage. There's huge baggage. There's huge payment that you're paying. Your bank account of integrity is being lowered every time. You don't just fill that up again. That's in your memory bank. That's what you just did to your soul. Like, it's not something you can just remedy, you know, go be like, oh, I'll find a better job next year and put more money in my bank account. It doesn't work that way, does it?
No. Well, here's the thing, and this is what it really breaks. I mean, I think it's the most powerful argument is that everybody's doing this, right? Everybody's having sex outside of marriage. So the stat that I read years ago was that only 3% of people made it to saving sex for marriage, only 3% of the population. So if that's the case, right, and everybody believes that you got to try before you buy, that's what everybody's told me. You got to take a car for a test spin, right? That's what everybody says. If that's the case, then why is the divorce rate 50%? Because that's what everyone is doing. Everyone is trying before they buy, and 50% of the people are getting divorced. And what I would argue is that of the other 50% that don't get divorced, what percentage of them are actually happy? Because I don't think it's I think a lot of people stay for the wrong reasons. No one says it's the wrong reasons. They stay for the kids, they stay for the finances or whatever else, but they're not because they're happy necessarily. So that just tells you right there, if you go about this the way that everybody else does, then your chances of being happily married are not good. They're actually quite slim, maybe 1 in 10. So you have to be smarter though than the average bear. I mean, be honest. You have to be smarter and think, okay, well, if 97% of the people are going out and having sex before marriage, and they're getting these results, why am I going to be different? What am I going to do different than everybody else?
Well, we do have data on like virgins marrying each other have the by far highest marriage satisfaction rates and divorce rates. So like, it's like a slam dunk on that data.
Sexual satisfaction, all of it. They do better across the board and everything.
Yeah. They don't have it's basically ignorance is bliss, I think.
Yeah. Well, people don't want to hear it when you say that, because I mean, numbers don't lie. So how do you explain that?
It's basically a direct correlation of body count to negative marriage outcomes, and it's just, especially for women, it is also like they'll try to say some like studies like men it doesn't really matter, but I've seen other studies where it does matter. It's just not as steep of a decline for men as it is women. So yeah, in the end, it matters.
I think for the men, it's going to be the fact that if you're not leading with finding a wife, because the difference is now, I'm not thinking about getting married. I have to get to the point, even if you're not committed to saving sex for marriage, if you know in the back of your mind that maybe we'll have sex, like unless you're like really bought in, I feel like to the point sometimes like I might die if I could, sin again in that area, because I've built up this platform and I've made so much content around waiting. So I've been very protective of that. So the way that I evaluate a woman to go out with is completely different than I did before. So you're not even screening them on the same level. So the chances that you're going to find the right girl that's actually going to be that good wife to you and make you happy long term is good, because what you'll do is you're going to lead with your penis, or on some level, unless you know that you're not getting a payoff. There's no way we're having sex, so there's no payoff unless we get married. And now you're screening differently, and there's a much better chance that you'll actually find that one. In addition to, like, if you rack up a 50 body count, you are funking up the dating pool for other men, right? Because the same guys that will tell you to do that will tell you to find a girl that's got a low body count. So how does that work?
That goes to a question here that Katie just dropped. On Glenn's live stream about an hour ago, a guy asked, isn't it unrealistic for a high body count guy to demand a low body count girl when they don't hold themselves to that standard? Just curious what we think on that.
I mean, she's got a point, but I think a lot of times women don't mind. I think one of you guys had sent me a message about that before, where it's almost like, and I put this on my dating profile recently, that I was saving sex for marriage, and I feel like I got less interactions because of it.
Oh yeah, that'll definitely get you less.
On some level, women are attracted to a bad boy, but she does have a point. It's not any less sin for a man to go out and be sexually immoral than it is for a woman, but it is different. I think the difference is this. This is what I've said before. It's pissed me off. Is for a man to be promiscuous, he probably has to achieve some level of status in order to go out and have sex with multiple women. For a woman to be promiscuous, she just has to lack discretion. Any woman can be promiscuous. Every woman can be promiscuous in the world. All she has to do is lack discretion. That's it. Not so much for a man, which is why I think women even look at it differently, because even the best man, even a complete stud, can't go out and sleep with a different woman every night. Probably some nights he's going to strike out, but a woman can go out and have sex with 10 different men every day, regardless of what she looks like. So I think that's probably why the world looks at it different. It doesn't make it any less wrong in God's eyes, but I don't think, and even women look at it different. Like a woman, one of the first things that she'll call another woman that like she doesn't respect is a slut, even if she doesn't know her. right? That's that nobody says, oh, that guy's a slut. Like, I wouldn't say that to another man. Like, he's gay, or maybe he's an asshole, or whatever. But we're not going to say he's a slut. Oh, he sleeps with all these. More likely not a way to criticize him. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but I'd love to hear it.
I agree. I think that I struggle a lot with Christian men specifically, and I'm only saying this for Christian men because it applies to our being renewed and being new creatures. Like the whole biological us being biologically inclined, and this excuse that guys use says evolutionary biology, we need to plant our seed everywhere, and this is why I'm wired this way. And once you're crucified with Christ, you're supposed to believe you're a new creature. And with all that comes a whole new list of things you identify with. You're carnal. You're supposed Paul says we're crucified with Christ and then risen with him. And so it's like, I think they're just making themselves excuses so that they can feel like, yeah, I'm a man, so I'm not pair bonding, or the oxytocin, or they start to use these scientific explanations for why sex does not matter as much to us. But if you're a believer, it's incredibly important. I mean, look at how Christ modeled the church, the bride of Christ. What is the consummation is meant to procreate, right? You do that with two people, then you have fruit, right? How much more sacred does it get than that? It doesn't.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're doing. We're put here to do. So if you subscribe to that belief, then you need to expect change, and I just see a lot of Christian guys struggling with that excuse. You're like, oh, I'm just made this way. And it's like, well, no, you were made that way. You're born again here, so it's different. You got to claim it. You got to speak the new truth of who you are.
Let's say you did that, like to her question, like if you did that, but your past is full of a giant body count, is it still fair? Do you expect a low body count wife?
Is it still fair? Is it fair? Man, dude, I'd say it's up to the wife if she's like,
Yeah, and that's my answer. It's like, it's really like men have a preference for that. It's up to the women to enact that preference on men. It's not our problem that it's, quote, a double standard. It's just the reality of our preferences are different.
It'd be different if you went out there just expecting that. Like, then you're just an asshole, man.
Yeah. I wouldn't go out and marry a girl that had slept with as many men as I slept with women. There's no way I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't respect her because, again, when a woman sleeps with a high number of men, it usually speaks about the way the value that she sees in herself. And she means she lacks self-esteem in some level. And maybe you could say that it could be true for men too, but I don't think it's the same.
I would agree.
Well, I want to push back a little bit on we kind of brought this topic up because a lot of the red pill guys will be like, keep really healthy, get the 6-pack abs, make the money, build this frame up where you're pretty much doing well on every other aspect of life but women, and be a rampant, fiend with women, if you will. And that's okay. And I'm sure you can attest to this when you were out there living that lifestyle. How can you focus on Christ if you're being driven by the desire, which is the highest, most, primal desire, our sexual desire, right up there with food and water, especially as men, because we have testosterone. We're driven highly to go hunt, to procreate.
Yeah.
That's why we have to control ourselves from murdering, but I digress. How can we focus on Christ with both eyes and our heart and the truth of what Christ is if we have been blinded by this desire for these women? Because it's a very powerful desire. And I don't think it's the way God made us in his image, right?
Yes.
So, I just don't feel like a lot of these guys are taking the truth on that, because even when I was young.
How many Christian guys, though? I think we're talking about the secular guys, like saying that.
I just saying God's image. You're made in God's image. I'm just applying that as a blanket statement to Christians and non-Christians.
Well,
he created all things.
Yeah, the non-Christians, though, they're not going to care about that. But
I think that they do. I think that it starts when you're a young man and you open up that first, porno magazine, or you see something that you shouldn't see, and innately there's a bit of guilt there. Now, maybe these guys have went so far that they don't remember that greenhorn moment of guilt, and then they were kind of indoctrinated past that to not give that credibility. But I guarantee you, every one of them had that moment where God's image and the Spirit and the law that God wrote on their hearts spoke out to that action, and it knew inherently this is wrong. This is not the same thing as murdering the elk out there. You know, I'm murdering my brother, or I'm murdering something. This is not the same killing. Like, this is not the same, you know.
I heard somebody say, I bet you no one ever said at Hugh Hefner's funeral that at least he's in a better place. I thought that was funny because it's got a dual meaning. But I'm like, look at, Hugh Hefner had a lot of sex, a lot of fun, I'm sure, but did he live a great life? I mean, that's kind of the question. I think for a Christian standpoint, we have to look at this from an internal perspective, because I think, like you're saying, guys will say, well, it doesn't come back. Nobody's going to think negatively of me. Maybe they'll think obviously very highly of me if I go out and have a 50 body count, and I won't get the divorce, rate thing and all that. But again, are you going to fulfill the purpose that God put you on this earth for? No, probably not, right? It's going to hurt your witness. I know when I was living in the world, so I was actually leading a Bible study in a bar, in a nightclub. And,
right on, dude.
And it was great. It was like 50 people flew off Fight Club, and like there were strippers and drug dealers coming to my Bible study. We were in purpose-driven life. We would go out and feed the homeless. It was amazing for a little while. I didn't have good accountability. I ended up having sex with two different girls about a month apart, and I didn't tell anybody because I knew it looked bad, and some people found out.
Zacharias.
Were they in the Bible study?
Yeah. So
wow.
So when people found out about it, they confronted me, and that's when I sat down from leading it, and I just spiraled and made a mess. And but I couldn't talk about God, and I knew people knew. Here I was really trying to make this difference, and the devil got me. But I just felt like so bad about myself. And maybe it was the devil condemning me, but I also knew I couldn't say anything. Nobody was going to listen to me anymore. They knew what I was doing. And it's like, so I had no witness anymore. So like the devil took several years of my life. Now I've done some great things over the last 12 years, but it was only because I was really walking it. I was talking about how freaking hard it was at times. I was vlogging all the time about my life and some of the frustrations that I had with God and all that, but it wasn't easy. So like, I think from a Christian man's perspective, we have to look at this from an eternal perspective, because we are going to, one day there's going to be rewards, or maybe not rewards. Maybe there's going to be punishment. There will be. And I want to hear, well done, good and faithful servants. That motivates me. But even from a non-Christian man's perspective, like David Lee Roth, he was on Rogan's podcast not long ago. That dude's like 60 some years old. He was this huge sex symbol in the early 80s, lead singer of Van Halen. I mean, probably had sex with who knows how many women. But if you look at him now, he looks like a crazy old man. He was never married, no kids, as far as I know, no family. He just lived a very shallow, selfish life. And at the end of his life, what is there, except for a bunch of, he had some good moments, I'm sure. He had some fun nights. But at the end, what is his legacy? What did he do? Will he hear, well done, my good and faithful servant? No, probably not. So and maybe he's not even thinking that way. It is hard to convince a non-Christian man to walk this, which is why I always start the conversation with them in the way that I did. It goes back to the fact that you'll probably get stuck in a sexless marriage. But
we're all shepherds, man. I mean, like, his legacy is DLR's great leads, one of the best frontman ever. Brother. I mean, he just dropped bomb after bomb. The guy was a badass genius, and he has a legacy of music. But what the Bible teaches us is what gives us fulfillment is being shepherds. We're meant to have things grow, the great discipleship, like this small Bible study. I mean, the United States. I'm reading this book by Eric Metaxas. It's called "Letter to the American Church." He talks about the American church just being fixated with evangelism, and that if they can get one person to say one prayer, and it's like, then you've done your job, and they could die tomorrow. So that's the most important thing. But we forget, what we get as men, our reward is in discipleship, and it's way harder. You got to sit there with a guy, and you got to sit there for years to watch him grow. And that is the bedrock of the church, is discipleship, deep bonds that are strong, that can face any storm, man, because you've done the work, the dirty, dirty work, the messy work of church. And that's what men find their legacy. When you I follow this guy. He's a wonderful sort of one of our spear tips for Muslims. His name's David Wood. He's actually a psychopath, tried murdering his dad with a hammer, and he has a family now, and he's learned how to love. Like, his testimony as far as a person learning how to love and being transformed by love, not knowing how to love, being a psychopath, it's amazing. But he led what's the name of the guy who's the Muslim he led? He died of cancer. He wrote like Nabil, right? And he worked with that guy. How long was it? 4 or 5 years?
4 years in college.
4 years in college. I mean, real discipleship. I mean, they slept in the same dorm.
Well, God works like that, because that's what made him into the beast that he was. Because Nabil,
but that's
was
some of David's legacy.
Sharpened,
yeah, and that's some of David's legacy. Like, he looks at Nabil. He's not with us. God bless him. But he wrote these books. The outreach to the Muslim community from that kind of due diligence, taking the Great Commission seriously, not just with a simple prayer. That's a legacy we can have. We could be spiritual fathers. I'm sure that's where you get a lot of your, that sensation of the kingdom, pushing the kingdom forward, having spiritual sons. That is a real legacy. DLR, he has some platinum records, and people will be sucking on his wang forever for all of his prowess in the music. But the truth is, there's a pathetic thing that we can all see. Yeah. If a man doesn't have that family, or that, like we said, that spiritual family discipling, we see that as a huge deficit in his character. I mean, we do.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to point out, Rob, that you brought up, which I think is really, really important. John's reading Letters to the Church by Metaxas, and I am reading The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Metaxas also wrote the introduction to it. Give like a small synopsis of this man's life. I recommend it highly to anyone who's listening. He goes into what he calls cheap grace, and it's his idea of what's consumed the modern Western church, in the idea that you can be saved without obedience. And there's this juxtaposition between obedience and belief. And that in belief, you can kind of put faith in there, right? And he says, well, you can't obey unless you believe, and you don't believe unless you obey.
Mm-hmm.
So he brings the rich young ruler, and he writes extensively about this man. And he writes about Peter, and he writes about Levi. He writes about these people Jesus saw on the road or walking around doing his mission. And he would look at them and he'd say, follow me, right? And there's no, what he was asking for them was obedience to the mission, to discipleship. And we don't always have this logical, rational delineation of what to expect. Sometimes God just calls us, many times, just to obey, to believe and obey.
Yeah, and we have a huge list of people like, I want to know God's will for my life. And they have this sort of arrogance when they first are reborn. I see it a lot. Like, what's my anointing? Am I going to do evangelism, preaching? They have like these 5 low-hanging fruit as far as their anointing. It's like the Bible is completely filled with his will for your life. But it seems boring and monotonous and unexciting. But that's what Paul calls the endurance that creates character. You have to endure these things to create a character so that you can have agency in the world on behalf of God. He can work through you. Metaxas brings up a really cool story, and I'm probably going to butcher this, but I'll do my best here. So he brings up a guy who's walking a tight wire in between like a massive, like the Grand Canyon, right? He's got a bunch of people sitting around him watching him, and he walks it a couple times back and forth, and then he walks up to a wheelbarrow and he grabs it and he asks him, he's like, how many of you people think I can walk this wheelbarrow across this tight wire? And everybody's like, yeah, I think you can do it. I believe you can do it. So he sees one guy in the crowd and he's like, pretty serious. He's like, yeah, I believe you can do it. He's like, do you believe I can do it? And the guy's like, yeah, sure. So he's like, well, how about you get in this wheelbarrow and I push you across? And that's where things get real. People are like, well, do you really believe he can do it or not? Where does your belief really stand? You know, and that's where the Christian, this is what Eric Metaxas is kind of describing, the Christian dilemma, which is the same thing we have as men, and trying to orient ourselves in a value structure that gives us legacies. We say this stuff, but none of us are getting in the wheelbarrow. You know, it's like a lot of these guys will use all these excuses and say, well, I can't get in the wheelbarrow because it's too cold, or, you know, I have my wife over here. I got to leave, you know, me to get in a meeting. And it's all just a cop out, man. It's all just a cop out.
Yeah, I was thinking about one thing, an analogy I used to use before was, imagine, and this is what the manosphere guys are really notorious for. They talk about the world and how the world is burning. You know, everybody's aware, but then they bring marshmallows to the fire. That's what they do. They just do things to benefit themselves. It's almost like, imagine if there was a city and everybody was on welfare. Nobody was going to work. They were just taking the free checks because the government was giving them out. And therefore, no one was actually self-actualizing. They're not reaching their potential because they're not working and they're getting the free handouts. At some point, as men, we have to be the ones to stand up and say, I'm not going to take the free check. I don't care if everybody else is taking it. I'm not going to take it because it's messing it up for everybody. That really is what we have to do as men, as Christian men.
Absolutely.
Because the women are giving it out now, and it's so easy to go out and get free sex, but everybody recognizes the damage that it's doing. It's the world's a bad place. So like, that's the only way to turn the ship around, man, is some men are gonna have to stand up and say, I don't care if everybody takes it, I'm not gonna. And it's so freaking hard because, man, I'm doing it. And if you would have had this conversation with me a few years ago, it probably would have been a lot different, because I was more in the mindset of like the payoff, the girl that you're gonna get, all that. And now I'm just kind of like, man, I'm just have to be obedient. I don't know if there's going to be a payoff. I'm not sure. And it's not easy. Sometimes I think I'm screwing up a lot, you know, because it gets harder actually as you get older, I feel like, because it's like the dating pool shrinks, you know, the window's closing and you're like, man, what I thought was going to go this way and God was going to reward me isn't happening. So it almost looks good to go back to Egypt sometimes. Forgetting what it was really like, you know?
Yeah.
So, but I don't know if you want to get into this part of the conversation. For me, like I came across some information that at least I would say is eye-opening, where I was completely bought into, so like I was never very good at monogamy. Like in my previous relationships, I cheated, and but when I gave my heart to the Lord, I assumed that was the only relationship structure that was acceptable to Him. One day, God was going to give me this amazing woman that would fulfill me, and I wouldn't feel like that was a real possibility. So I was committed to not having sex before marriage, but I was just as committed to not settling. So it was like two opposing forces that I was stuck in the middle of. And you know, at times I was very lonely. I was, you know, depressed, horny, all the emotions that I went through. But I recently learned, and I would love to talk about it if you guys want to, is that polygamy, a man having more than one wife, was never forbidden by God. It was actually, if you look at all the patriarchs, I know it's a society in Western civilization tells us, you know, that there's scriptures that we use to infer that was something that was tolerated, I guess, let's say, for people in the test. But I wonder if there's men out there that wouldn't be a better solution than fornication or divorce if they've already married.
I'm gonna say
Well,
one thing, then I'm gonna let my brother take this, because we had the same conversation with Rolo. But I will say, going back to, what did you say? It's a euphemism that you used in the beginning of "show me the most beautiful woman in the world, I'll show you guys tired of banging her." I think that applies to 2 or 3 wives as well. Like, I don't think it's gonna meet the need. I just want to throw that one out there. Maybe even if you have 5 wives. I mean, let's look at King Solomon. He was up to the 700s. Like, I don't think you're ever gonna get there. Don't think it's gonna make it any easier. In fact, I think you're probably better off with one, like Adam and Eve. But I digress. Johnny boy, you want to take it?
Well, okie dokie. So this is a tough conversation to have with people who are used to constructing arguments based on text and the literal communication of text, and submitting Bible verses in a certain order that express something very concisely. So it's a struggle with those people because they are going to want to see that verse that says, don't cut somebody off in traffic, even though it doesn't exist and we know it's wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
So my desire for them is to take on a different, and it kind of, I'll start with the way that you open the Bible as a believer. When you first become a believer, your instinct is to be subjective with the material. You're going to read it and think God is talking directly to you. And it's beautiful. It starts the intimacy of the relationship. You'll open up one page and be like, wow, that verse was just for me. And it may be. And that's the way I think God answers prayers. I think he's very, very gentle with new believers for that very reason. However, as you begin to walk, you begin to have a less, I use this word because I think it makes the most sense, but schizophrenic look at the church itself. I use that word because schizophrenia is a hyper rationality on a focal point that's unfortunately not taking in the big picture, right? So they'll think that the church is here and now, it's in the West, it's this generation, blah, blah, blah. They forget that the church has been alive. Abraham is still alive, right? We have a living body that's been going on since Adam. And so what that makes you do when you start to realize you're part of this transcendent church is that you need to take a more implicit view of the way Scripture is communicating. And so it goes something like this, right? We learned this early on with like fables and, Hansel and Gretel, right? Jack and the Beanstalk, all of these stories that aren't explicitly saying, don't disobey your parents or come home on time or the boy who cried wolf. Like, it doesn't end with the story saying, and don't scream about stuff that isn't really going on. Otherwise, people will ignore you. It's not explicit. The story does that and expresses the lesson perfectly with something you can actually remember. So the Bible does the same thing. It operates in the same way. So polygamy. How do we take an implicit view of that? What's being implied when we look at the Old Testament stories of men who engaged in it? What do we see? Abraham, he had several wives, right? We see all of the turbulence that was created there. Isaac, his son, he had one wife. We don't hear much about Isaac. Whenever in the Bible you don't hear much about somebody, it's because they lived a good life. It's because they did things right. In the very beginning, you have Enoch. I wish there was, chapters written about this guy, but all you hear is that he walked with God and God took him up. It's like 2 verses. So we get the bad apples because we're most likely a bad apple. So we're going to learn from them. So we see Abraham had issues. We see Jacob had issues. We see Solomon had issues. We see David had issues. And they came from having more than one wife. We see that happen all the time. So it's implied. We see it implied within the stories. Then you look at the way Paul took these stories. So Paul's a Pharisee. He had these things memorized. He had this implicit approach to exhuming the purpose in doctrine and teachings of the Old Testament. And he gave us in the New Testament this man for a woman. If you're going to be in a leadership role, right, you're going to have one wife.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and your desire as a Christian should be to shepherd, right? We should all want to be deacons in the church. You should all want to be affecting the program. So he's telling you, this is the way it's modeled. And then you go all the way back to Adam and Eve. One for one. You got a pair going on there. So that, I think it's implied all throughout our Bible, but to be able to produce a verse is going to be impossible. But you can't do that for cutting people off in traffic. You can't do that for insider trade. There's a ton of different things that we know are sin that you're not going to be able to produce a verse for.
I also think God allows, especially after the fall, allowed unoptimal circumstances to deal with the human condition that we were in.
Totally.
So, for example, like back then, there was so much war and chaos. And so I think you had massive gender imbalances, number one. So you think they would go conquer a nation that killed all the men. And now you have probably thousands of women literally without a man. And then back then, it's not like the women were these strong, independent women that could survive without, someone supporting them. So I think you had a lot of times where kings were literally taking in new wives because they conquered a nation, and they were just supporting these people. So
Yeah.
I think you had
And banging them.
you don't know.
Well,
You don't.
yeah,
I don't think
what I
you.
would say is we can't call it. I mean, to say it's we know it's sin, like you had said. There's lots of things that we know is sin, even if it's not explicitly stated. The Bible's very specific about a lot of things. It says women can't sleep with animals. I mean, it's pretty specific, and it never was explicitly said. Actually, in Exodus 21, it says if a man wants to take more than one wife, it kind of outlines how he has to do it. If you read, and that was in the law.
Yeah, he has to treat them equally, and
and he can't deny him conjugal rights, which means he has to continue having sex with the first wife. And so I can't think of one example in the Bible where something was right and not a sin. It was right, morally outlined, and then later it became a sin under the new covenant, because that's what people will say. We're under a new covenant now. I'm like, well, hold on a second. Jesus didn't come to abolish the law; he came to fulfill it. And God says He's the same today, yesterday, today, and forever.
Divorce did.
So He doesn't,
Divorce. Jesus changed a lot of the laws, I would say.
No, so did eating certain foods. A lot of things.
We don't have to abide by the Levitical laws, but doesn't mean there was nothing, as far as I know, that was okay and right in the Old Testament. Later became sin in the New Testament, because that's basically what we would be saying about polygamy. Because Moses was a polygamist and doesn't say anything about his life. I mean, there's not even an example of a good monogamous relationship in the Bible, as far as I know. I mean, Adam and Eve, maybe if he had a second wife, she would have talked them out of it. I don't know. So it's not that we can say just because every relationship has problems. The one verse that I would have never considered this personally, because I was, raised in America, and I just assumed that, it was wrong, but that deacons must be the husband of one wife. That was always the verse that I was like, well, there it is, right there. First off, deacons, it says, or elders, in other translations.
Overseers and deacons, yep.
Okay, but that's still a minority, in the church. So it's not the majority. The majority of men that wouldn't apply to. But that word, the original word was mia. And that word it also means a or first. And it was used, like, for example, the believers gathered on the mia day of the week, the first day of the week. So that, what some people say is that A would be the husband of a wife, meaning they have to be married, or the husband of first wife, meaning they can't be divorced. Now, I don't know if that's 100% true, because it has all those meanings. But if it did mean one wife, that would mean that Moses, the man that spoke face to face with God, who wrote the law, couldn't be an overseer in your church, your little 50-member church. Like, for me, I find that hard to believe. You guys don't.
Well, I see, for instance, like,
yeah,
the king when Israel wanted a king, because I talked to Glenn about this. Like, we had a new dispensation of law, right? So things did change. We are now the high priest. Back in the Old Testament, you had one high priest. So there's this shift in the administration of the church. We have direct communication with the Father. We have unionization with the Holy Spirit. The Old Testament was different. So when I look at Moses, I'm like, yeah, he had a different set of laws that applied to him. He wasn't perfect, and neither was Israel, but God still blessed them despite their imperfections. So when they wanted a king, God's like, fine, I'll give you a king. I'm still going to bless you. You guys are going to divide. You guys are going to hate having a king. It's going to suck. But if you want to be like the cool kids, here's a king. So I don't know if it means that the new dispensation declared, because there's a verse I read that's amazing. It's the closing of Romans, actually kind of helped me to understand this, because I was listening to these Muslims kind of get up this Christian guy's ass, and they're like, well, you guys don't know what you believe, and your belief is just evolving, so you don't even know anything, so what are you doing? And they're trying to make him seem like he's standing on a foundation of sand, because it's like, right, what are you going to believe tomorrow? And so I was like, yeah, well, there's some truth to that. It's kind of brutal, but let's see what Romans has to say at the end of Romans 16. Beautifully said. It says, now to him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages, but
has now been disclosed and through prophetic writings has been made known to all nations according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. To the only wise God be glory forevermore through Jesus Christ. Amen. So that talks of the veil being lifted for this second iteration of closeness to God. Because if you have closeness to God, you also have clarity. You have more closeness. That intimacy yields more righteousness, more of that beauty that we all yearn for so deeply, which is to do God's will. And so that changed when Jesus rose from the dead and we had the Holy Spirit. So there is that refinement. We know more clearly what we're supposed to do. We know more clearly how marriage is supposed to be handled. We know more clearly about all these things. That's what I would say, basically.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd probably also add that you're gonna number one, stuff did change with the Jesus and the Old Testament law, because Jesus made a lot of stuff way more strict. Like Moses was allowing divorce for all kinds of reasons during that law, and he was like, wait a minute, you're only supposed to be divorcing basically for sexual immorality, and that's it. He also made a lot of the law like show that it's not the physical action that matters, it's actually what starts in your thoughts.
Right.
So I would say like stuff did change pretty drastically as far as the standards being set, partially to show that it's impossible to keep those standards, and that's why you need Jesus. And number two, I would, you're gonna have a hard, like, you still got kind of to just take the golden rule, like you're gonna have a hard time with the golden rule on that in today's circumstance, because you're literally fighting females' natural mate guarding instincts. Like I recently kind of heard about a polygamous environment. I won't name any names, but it is hell at home. It is hell. And the women, like, I think will sign up for that because the guy, provides for them enough, but they're going against their female nature on mate guarding. Like they do that stuff naturally. They care about the investment of the man into their life. And so I think there's like, you will put her through hell, or the multiple women through hell. And I don't know if there's a way around that.
Yeah, I think the culture.
Maybe if they were culturally conditioned for like a generation or two to like being in that type of environment, like it would turn off their brain on that. But
how about you might be put through hell?
That's right.
That's right.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what that household I heard about sounded like hell.
There you go.
Well, let me say this.
One thing I would. Oh, sorry. I
No,
wanted
go
to
ahead.
add. I know there's three of us. There's only one of you.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. I apologize. But another thing that I see in distinction between the temple being a physical place in the Old Testament, and then the church, the temple becoming these bodies, and the gift of the Holy Spirit being poured out onto us, his church, really given us superpowers, which we should be using to make heaven on earth real. That's our job. We are superpower, and we have that. The Holy Spirit has been poured out onto us. That really changes that temple being this physical place out there. You get ready to walk into it, to a daily thing, which you can see the Jews saw sin as an action physically acted out.
They still do.
They still do. Yeah. Us as Christians, Jesus makes the point to say, well, no. It's in your head. It's in your spirit first. This is where the sin comes. And that's what it ultimately creates a weaker man. It starts, we all know where it starts. We all know where weakness starts. And so I just wanted to.
And I appreciate that y'all are allowing me to kind of air this out, because I've been researching and thinking about this for the last.
We've been down the rabbit trail a lot too, kind of lately.
Yeah. Well, and this is again, I've come up with a lot of reasons why maybe God allowed it, and I appreciate that we're able to talk about it. Like, so one thing I learned is that Martin Luther, you have to believe, probably had a pretty good understanding of Scripture, right? Martin Luther said that there's no scriptural support for a man not being able to take multiple wives as long as his conscience is clear about it. He says that. He's quoted. So I'm like, there's the person that really had a pretty firm understanding of the word, said that. So I look at it as this, is like, okay, there's always going to be more marriageable women in the world than there are men, period. Like there's always going to be more women that want to get married because men don't want, they could be selfish and just sleep with women, or they're incarcerated, or they're homeless at higher levels. They die younger, for all the reasons. There's always going to be more marriageable women than there are men. What happens to those women? They just get pushed out of the sexual marketplace? Or can you fault them for going out and marrying or shacking up with some guy that's not a Christian because there's just not that many godly men out there? So I think that there's an argument that can be made. Yeah, you go back to the Old Testament and you say there was wars, so there was maybe a surplus of women. I would say that most men that are sexually active right now, most, not even just out of the single men, but probably most of the men that are sexually active are polygamous. They're just not, they're just lying.
Right.
That's why they have all these Facebook groups. Are we dating the same man, Baltimore? Are we dating the same man, Washington, D.C.? Thousands of women in these groups trying to catch the men. Because the thing is when you, and this is what, at least from what I've learned, is that monogamy, enforced monogamy, was a Greco-Roman thing. It was a law in Rome. It wasn't a law in Judaism. They were all polygamists, or that was the norm. And it was a law that you could only have one wife, but they all had mistresses, and there was brothels everywhere in Rome, which is kind of like where we're at now. It's a freaking cesspool, 50% divorce rate. And a lot of the people that are married probably are unfaithful. And the people that are single don't want to get married because they are like, what? I got one golden ticket. I got one. That's why they don't get married till 32, because they don't want to get trapped. And then think about this. If it was possible for you to take a second wife, how would that change the dynamic of the marriage, even if you never acted on it? I'll tell you what, you wouldn't be in a sexless marriage. Why? Because that woman wouldn't want you to go take a second wife. And that it almost emasculates it. What I think it would do is restore patriarchy. I'm not saying that I'm 100% right or that I'm going to do it, but I've wrestled with this. And what Martin Luther said, going back to him, he said, it's better than fornication and it's better than divorce, which is right now, we have a lot of both. We have people that just, they fornicate because for me, if I wasn't so committed to saving sex for marriage, because I didn't want to settle with my one choice, which I thought was the only way, I burned with lust. But most men aren't willing to do that. Most men are not that sold out to Jesus that they're going to just sit there and, like you said, cut their balls off for 10 years and just wait for this.
Well, I would also add, though, the same logic kind of on the polygamy side, you could put towards fornication, because we have had this argument many times too. The original, it looks like the fornication terms in the New Testament are aimed at brothel use, not necessarily sex outside of marriage. Like if you look at the original Greek of what porneia was talking about, or the term fornication itself, it seems aimed at prostitution. And so you could, I mean, it's the same kind of logic trail. I think you could get to work your way out of not having sin there. So, that's the kind of the overall.
Now prostitution is not a sin?
No, I'm saying fornication is aimed at prostitution, because that was the issue back then.
So if you don't pay for it, it's not a sin?
Well,
how does it work?
The argument is Paul's talking about brothel use, and so technically having sex with like your girlfriend wouldn't be sin, is the arguments we get thrown at us.
I don't believe that. I think, and this is why my beliefs are so radical. I still believe in sex before marriage is a sin, but you could probably marry more than one and not be a sin. Now, convincing the woman to do that, it's only going to be a small percentage of men that would even be able to pull it off financially and be able to find the women to do it and all that. But when I look at like the show Sister Wives, people bring that up to me anytime I've had this conversation with them, and they're like, "Look, at they're all splitting up." I'm like, he was married to 3 women for 17 years. You couldn't even make one marriage work for 5 years. He's got 50 years of freaking marriage under his belt, and you're trying to tell me that he's wrong. I'm like, maybe, I don't know, but you can't even make one work for 5. They're already divorced. All my divorced friends are telling me why it's wrong. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe. But I think if God did allow it, what I'd have to believe is it all has to stem from keeping the man in the home. Because when the man is not in the home, bad things happen to the children. Fatherless homes, 10 times more likely for divorce, commit suicide and drop out of college, and depression and all the things, right? So like, how do you keep the men in the home? Is it an ideal situation for a woman? Maybe not. But is it better than a man leaving and that kid, those children, or stepping out and having a side chick and lying? And because that's what's happening now in a lot of cases. And you have no responsibility for that girl. You're just having sex with her and you're passing her on to the next guy at some point. And it creates a cesspool. That's not what God says. He says, you got to marry her and then you're responsible for her.
But
Now,
let's be honest, like the driving factors for a man to want more than one wife is not because he wants to connect with more than one woman intellectually. That's like not the driving fact. It's just sex.
Well,
I agree.
that's because you're
Do you think
thinking
that
of
that's
this,
true?
like I was gonna say that you brought up, and so did Mike. You know, the troubled times where for instance, war. There's all the men got murdered. I doubt most of the guys are like, man, I'm gonna get that hot chick over there. Maybe it was like not a hot chick at all, you know. And he was just, that's a wife. I gotta provide,
This stuff
be a
it
man.
exists today. There's like
This
20%,
polygamy thing.
There's like 20 million extra like Eastern European women than men.
Right.
And like, what are they supposed to do?
The idea of polygamy and like having two hot wives maybe isn't like the real idea of like the foundation for polygamy.
Well, that was my guess with Solomon's wives. I got a feeling he's probably not even sleeping with
He was the king.
10% of them.
He's one of the most richest.
That was another thought I had. Is like, you know, that if you could live a perfect life, like you could you wouldn't need Jesus, right? Like it's a possibility, but it's never going to be, you could never do it.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of feel that way about the Old Testament, where that law is, if you have several wives, you need to treat them equally. It's like, you can never do that. You're going to favor one more than the other. There's like, you could barely do that with like the most basic things. You could barely pour 2 even glasses of water. Like, how could you? It just seems ridiculous to be able to like, oh yeah, I can do this.
One point you brought up, Rob, about Red Pill calls this dread, I believe. And you were talking about polygamy restoring, quote, the patriarchy, and not being in a sexless marriage because your wife has what the Red Pill calls dread. They think, oh, well,
Competition anxiety.
he might get another woman. And we hear of a lot of Christian men having trepidations about ending up in a sexless marriage. And we like to ask a lot of questions. So what are some of the questions you would ask to one of these people that ends up in a sexless marriage?
Oh, I mean, I do think that that's probably part of the reason why men are so hesitant to get married these days is that, but also the marriage laws, the divorce laws, that is, are heavily in the woman's favor, as you know, Rollo talks about and others. I don't know what I would say to them. I think for me, had I discovered this information and completely accepted it, because I'm still not, I can't say I'm 100% there yet. I'm still wrestling with the idea. I would have been married a long time ago. There were women over the last 12 years that liked me that probably would have been okay with it. Maybe, I don't know. I didn't bring it up because it wasn't an idea back then. But I look at these women over the year and I like them enough. Let's just say I like them enough. I didn't think they were that one like this one person that I assumed would come along. And I don't even know if this person exists, to be honest, anymore. But they went off and they married like guys that weren't Christian, or some of them didn't marry. They just had a kid. One girl had a kid with this guy that wasn't a Christian. He's kind of like a drunk, and she stopped coming to church. And and other girls. One girl went through probably 4 or 5 guys over the last few years. Most of them not believers. And I'm like, so I can understand why God would allow it. Is it ideal? No, going back to Adam and Eve, no. Probably was one man, one woman, but God did make concessions after the fall. Like clothes, for example. People will say, well, I'm like, a nudist could make the same argument to say, well, we should walk around naked because that was how God originally did it. Well, I mean, no, we live in a fallen world, so things changed after. But yeah, as far as what would I say to the person that was thinking about like hesitant to get married because they were afraid to get stuck in a sexless marriage? I would probably I would probably bring up this idea to them, that I would send them the information that I discovered, because I think that the way I'm dating right now, I'll be honest with you, is after being completely sold out to the idea of monogamy, because I, again, didn't know that there was any other way that was, I believe, was acceptable to God, any other relationship structure. Now I'm dating with the idea that if I meet a girl that I like so much, that if I bring this idea up, that there may be a chance that I would want a second wife at some point, and she says, I'm out, and I'm afraid of losing her because I like her that much, then I'll be monogamous. It's fine. Great, let's get married. That'd be great. But if I don't meet a girl that I like that much, that if she leaves and I'm like, okay, then go. Then I may pursue polygamy, because for me, it was never about necessarily, what people would think, or it was only about being in the will of God. That was all I was trying to do. I was just trying to remain obedient. And if that meant being abstinent and lonely, I was going to do it. But yeah, this for me, learning that changed everything. It changes the way you date.
So
I think
it sounds like you're saying two halves make a whole kind of thing. Like if you find a wife that maybe has great breasts and loves the Lord, and you're like, you know what? She's awesome up top. And the other lady's like, man, she's got a great ass. I'm just gonna put these two together, and we're gonna be in business. It's like, what's going on? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I want to know what you're gonna get out of it, because if they're both subpar, it just seems like you're getting more of what you don't want.
It's not just the physical, but there was.
But you would know. You spent a long time doing this, and I'm asking sincerely. I'm not just making a joke here.
Sure.
I know a lot of guys and a lot of people, especially after you've had these experiences. I'm sure there's a subconscious checklist that's unreal, literally unreal. So,
I mean, for the women, wouldn't you say they could be polygamous too? I mean, like, how does that make any? Because if there's no difference, then they could be too. I mean, it's like,
well, I think the Bible
making the rules.
The Bible's really clear about what's right and what's wrong, right? The Bible says that adultery. You know how adultery is defined in the Bible? It's having sex with another man's wife, not another woman's husband.
I've heard all these arguments before, but I feel like if you work the mathematics backwards, it still ends up being men shouldn't go bang women that aren't, even if they're not married, and those other women aren't married, because they will be married. They should be being married, and if they're having sex, they should be married. It's the consummation part. There's a sacred. Yeah. It's a sacred part of marriage. It's consummation. So
yeah. I think we're on the same page with that. You were just talking about polyandry, though. Like, why can't a woman go out and have multiple husbands? Because the Bible's clear about it. It's really not. I didn't make the rules. Like go look it up. Or it's not. Even.
How many more rules are there in the Bible that apply? Because I think that's very much an Old Testament thing. I mean, I don't think that. I think it's sin for people who are oblivious to it and living in innocence of what the Scripture is really implying throughout it. And then I think, like, you can rationalize your way into a place where it's like, yeah, I can have two wives and treat them equally. It's like, you really think you can treat them equally? You really think you can do that? All right, buddy, go have fun with that.
Now, I bet
you're gonna have to answer to God, because you have to do that. That's the implication. I have to treat him equally all the time. So you're setting yourself up for more baggage and sin.
Well, you got to love your wife as Christ loved the church. That's pretty tall order too. I mean, how many of us are actually going to do that? I mean, we might try, but more than likely we'll fail. So I'm not saying, and I'm not even saying that it wouldn't be a disaster. It could be a disaster for many people, and you will have favorites and potentially, but
I'm interested in Joe's question. Like, what are you going to get out of having two sort of that sounds so bad. It sounds so bad, but two of like, I guess that'll do pig situations,
What if you had a child and then you decided you want a second child? And then the first child was like, why do you need a second child? Aren't I enough? Like, because I like being a father, and one of you is amazing, but two would be even better. Maybe three would even be better than that. I don't know. But for me, I met girls that I liked, but it wasn't because I guess because I passed and because I could in monogamous relationships that I did cheat, and I never wanted to do that, and I never wanted to get divorced. So I assumed that there would be one that came along that, I was willing to bet the farm on. And because it didn't happen, it led me to I believe it led me to the place where I was open to the idea that maybe there was some other possibility out there. And going back, it could be a disaster, but is it sin? That's the part that I don't see any evidence for it being sin. I see God said to David in the Old Testament, I gave you your master's wives. And if they weren't enough, I would have given you more. When does God ever give you something bad? For me, and I think there's probably men in your audience that are listening that are scared to get married. They're like, maybe they're in the place that I was, and they're just like, it's a big decision and they don't want to get trapped. They don't want to go from, maybe having 40 flavors to one flavor for the rest of their life. Maybe it's a hard concept for them to get their mind around. I don't know. And knowing that, not to say you'll ever do it, but that that they could and still be in the will of God might change the fact that they would actually be willing to get married and stop fornicating if that's what they're doing. Or if it was somebody that was in, a marriage that was thinking about getting divorced, maybe that changes things for them. I don't know. I mean, I think that would be a hard thing to spring on your wife if you didn't kind of tell her that up front. That might be a hard sell. But I do think it's a better option than fornication and divorce. And when I look at the world right now, it's a cesspool, man. And I think people look up to guys like Tate and other guys that are out, and they have all these women, even Christian men, they look up to them. Like on some level, there's probably a little like, man, lucky bastard. Right now, I know that the things we talked about, and it's very shallow and all the things, but there is a way to do it potentially biblically, not the way they're doing it, not going out and just impregnating a bunch of girls and marrying them and being responsible for them. And to me, I feel like it's almost like a mop, and it cleans up a lot of the cesspool that exists now in the world. And maybe I'm seeing it wrong. I don't know.
I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna interrupt just so we can hit these super chats. Rusty Fuel is just dropping them all like a
Thank
boss.
you, Rusty.
Doing good work.
You're funding everything all the time.
Rusty here. The
Rusty must
consummation
be
is
rich.
about becoming one intimate unit, one flesh. Procreation is a secondary purpose. The single union is supposed to reflect our connection with Jesus. Quote, raised with him. See Rusty again. Peace,
Right on, Rusty.
Peace and joy come me from God, not marriage.
It's good. Good point.
Is marriage to the second wife a lovingly to the first wife? Polygamy is permitted in the new covenant, so polygamous families don't have to break up as they converted to Christianity.
Oh, that's a great point.
Right.
I didn't think of that.
The
just sounds
polygamy
like
thing might hurt your witness. I would say, I think objectively it's hard to make the case it's sin. I think, but at the same time, I think objectively we all know the reason why the man would do it in today's world is not probably from the Old Testament way, where I think it's very clear in the Old Testament a lot of that stuff was done like, we want to marry the kingdoms together, and so let's give him another one of our daughters, or we conquered this nation. So I think the reasoning in the Old Testament is not what's the reasoning today, which is really the man just wants more variety. And I think that's just going to be a tough, I feel like if that is the reason, and you also desire, I don't think any man's having multiple connections at a wife level with multiple women.
No,
I don't think
I
any man has the bandwidth for that.
Go ahead. I would like to bring up reiterate what I said earlier, in that bringing up that sort of, I think it's a euphemism. I don't know. I'm probably using that wrong, but show me the hottest woman in the world, I'll show you guys tired of banging her. I think that applies exponentially to males. So if you had an extra wife, you'd be happy with her for, I don't know, the honeymoon phase. And then pretty soon she'd be wife again. And then you'd have two of them. And then you'd be like, all right, going to the next one. And that being your motivation for getting wives would not fulfill that need that you're trying
That's
to
exactly
fill in
what
the
I was
first
going to
place.
say.
So I don't think it's a good solution for that problem. But like Mike had pointed out, Old Testament problems where there was we're marrying into families, there's multiple families, we're trying to unify groups of people, there's a warfare, there's a bunch of women that don't have husbands, are never going to procreate. We need to get these wives to men to have families, to put them so they can be fulfilled and have kids. Not you getting the hottest chick. It's more like, I gotta have another wife because we got these women here, and she might not be the hottest babe. I believe that that makes more sense, you know, than we look at like King Solomon with the you know, 1,000 different harem, you know, women and concubines for him to sleep with. It just goes more to the fact of like he couldn't even bang 2 chicks a day for a year and bang the same amount of chicks. You know what I mean? It's like it's an unfulfillable appetite, you know.
Yeah. It's insatiable. I agree.
I did look up some of the Jewish Orthodox community, like in Israel, they will permit polygamy now, but it's at the request. It's basically only at the request of like a woman coming to the priest and like saying there's no other men option, because I think they have small communities. They don't have enough men even. And so it's like they will make exceptions for those circumstances.
Yeah.
And so like in the Jewish community, that seems to be the circumstance.
Yeah.
And I imagine that's, you know, also why it was back then too, because the average man back in those days couldn't support a family. So it's like, well, I don't have a family, or I become a prostitute, or I'm wife number 12 of King David.
So I think, you know, the Jews only stopped doing this 1,000 years ago, and it wasn't for any reasons that were biblical. It was because they were afraid of anti-Semitism. So there's that. Now, I don't deny men want variety. I mean, and I think that whether you act on it or not, I think that that's a natural instinct. Whether, you know, the argument could be made that you should just control it, you know, and maybe you should. But I think there's an argument that could be made too. Like a man, if you were able to have more than one wife, I think it would not really, it would incentivize you to earn. You would feel like a king when you came home. You wouldn't feel like this emasculated man that where the woman was wearing the pants in the house and you know, like we said, you're potentially stuck in a sexless marriage. I just have a hard time believing that this is the best that we can do in America. 50% divorce rate. This is the best. I agree. So this is the best. God said monogamy. This is the way to go. And this is, I
think that number is kind of BS that they throw around the red pill too, because I think you should be looking at a divorce rate of the demographic you're in. Like if you're like an upper middle class Christian who actually like attends church on a weekly basis and is serious about their faith, like that divorce rate's like under 20%.
How many? And, what percentage of the population, men in this country, are godly, you know, godly men that would be a priest of their home?
Not many. I mean, I'm not
like 10
to
15%, I'm guessing.
That's why all the divorce rates, man. The churches aren't teaching what relationships should look like. You know, I mean, it's a breakdown that's systemic that ultimately lands in the lap of the men, sucking at leading, being big fat baby idiots, and it's what happens.
What percentage of the women are godly women?
I'd probably say equal. Probably low. It's a lot lower today than it was 20 years ago.
Definitely lower than 20 years ago, but I don't think it's lower. I definitely think there's more women that are, you know, maybe if it's 25, 20, maybe
it kind of depends also what you mean by that, because we talk a lot about like there's a ton of epiphany stage women, and I'm sure you've heard Rollo talk about that before. So as far as the number of like real, like, you know, the 20-year-old woman ready to get married and have children today, I'm thinking like 5%.
I think if you're going to go the polygamy route, you probably want to have a bunch of kids, like a crap load.
Well, that's what Elon Musk is doing. He's basically living that life unofficially.
That seems to be like the major motivator. Because, I mean, realistically, try having one wife and a couple kids. See if you can handle that.
Yeah, dude.
And then go ahead and grab another wife and some extra kids.
They start raising each other like Jordan Peterson said.
Parentification, then you're sucking at your job.
Well, the idea of parentification is you should be in a close fellowship. Like we should all have families, and the kids should be hanging out. We should have Thanksgiving and Christmas and weekend, and like the kids should be raising each other. And the husband. I mean, that's the way the ecosystem of a true community, a Christ body, should work. I mean, we can't fulfill all these roles ourselves, and that's the way the Western community really would have us being individuals, like this rugged individualism that has got nothing to do with Christianity and the Bible. So I definitely see what you're saying about the mop and the cesspool and trying to work that out. because it's a real issue, and like you were saying, there's a lot of this promiscuity. Like a lot of the guys are just having mistresses, for instance, back in the Greek Roman times, and there's always going to be that insatiable need. And us as Christian men, I think it's like, well, if you want to have a bunch of kids, great. If you can take care of a family, if you can do all these things, and you can keep your eyes on Christ and discipleship. And really what we're kind of getting at, it's like, all right, there's not a lot of Christians. There's not a lot of good Christian women. There's not a lot of good Christian marriages. There's not a lot of good relationships with Jesus, and there's not a lot of true disciples. There's not a lot of people that have weighed the cost of salvation and discipleship and put it above anything and everything else in their world. We've degraded what it is to be a Christian so far and secularized it so far that this is what we're left with, a cesspool, for lack of other words. And we're pointing fingers and we're going like, well, who and why and every, but really it's like, we're not putting Christ and truth at the center of our life every day, you know, as much and as hard as we should. And what are some of the tools you use to stay celibate and to continue on your life for 12 years? I mean, that is impressive.
Well, let me be honest. I had 2 isolated incidents over the last 12 years. One was 8 years ago, and one was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Just, mistake that happened one night. So it wasn't 12 years straight, but it might as well have been, because it wasn't anything. It wasn't regular sex. It was just like I tripped and I got up and I kept running. So it wasn't 12 years straight. It was 6 years straight, and then it was 12 years with those 2 mistakes. But still extremely difficult.
How was it? How hard was it to get running again after you fell?
Oh, dude, it was. So what I did, I went live. I did a live on social media about it, because what happened was, when I made that mistake, when I originally backslid, when I was leading that Bible study, and I didn't tell anybody, and the people confronted me really harshly, and it just made it worse because I didn't share it. When I did screw up, after I rededicated my life to God, I just did a Facebook Live about it and just told the world, because I was like, nobody's gonna like, haha, I got you. Like, I didn't want that to happen, so I just told. So for me, it created a lot of accountability, because it sucked, like I felt like I let people down. I was pretty vocal about my stance on it at that point. It was before, the first one was before the book. And then the next one was actually after. It might not have been after I wrote the book. It might have been right before that, or it was around the time I was writing the book, let's say. But I also confessed that. And for me, it was just, I didn't want to have to do that. So I went through the pain. There was a lot of lonely nights where I knew there were girls I could call to come over and make me feel better in the moment, but I wouldn't do it because I didn't want to have to confess it. So a good accountability, I would say, is one of the things that I've used. Fear of the rapture and Jesus coming back. I do believe we're going to see it, and that for me, like when I got baptized in the Spirit, I prophesied, and some of the things God told me was about the rapture and the second coming. And for me, it created a lot of fear, where I just was like, I didn't know when it was going to happen, and I didn't want to lead people astray too, because I was a pretty bad influence at one time in my life. Not intentionally. It was just a nightclub promoter, encouraging people to go out and just live for the moment.
Like, if you're dating now, do you have conversations like, how do you set your boundaries? Like, because I've always kind of assumed, like, if you're used to having sex in the past, you almost have to have stricter boundaries, because your brain's just going to go into that mode immediately.
100%. Yeah. No, for me, what happened was, after I made that first mistake 8 years ago, first I got sober for 7 years, because every time I drank, I just, not every time, but often if I was drinking, it would lead to me having sex with a girl somehow. So I quit drinking. And the next time I made a mistake was, again, about 4 years into it. And it was just a girlfriend was at the house. We were watching television. We had never even kissed or anything, but we were flirting. I knew it was dangerous. And I tried to tell her, like, hey, we should probably stop hanging out alone. And she made me feel like kind of like it could never happen. We're just too good of friends. And I let her, I honestly knew she was wrong, but I let her convince me that it was okay. And the very next time we hung out, we had sex. We just started kissing, and the next thing you know, I couldn't stop. Like once we got to a certain point, I just couldn't even grab the emergency brake. And I thought I was stronger than that. So then after that, I just decided I'm not hanging out alone with girls. And I did that for the most part for the last, 8 years. I haven't spent time alone with females there, although there has been, I've loosened it up a little bit. But not much, so.
How does that conversation go with them?
Well, I didn't date a lot either because I wasn't in a place like in my life that I felt like I was telling me to date. I really felt like he had me on the sidelines. It was just, I was getting my nonprofit off the ground, so I didn't have a lot of time or money. I didn't feel like I could bring somebody else into that. So I wasn't, for me, it was a little bit easier because I was waiting, but I wasn't dating, and I was talking to a friend the other day, and he's a Christian guy, and he's having sex with his girlfriend. And he was like, I don't know how you did it. And I was like, well, I wasn't dating. So it's a little bit different. Once you're starting to develop those feelings for somebody, especially if you feel like they're the one, I'm sure it becomes a lot more difficult. And so, what I would say is keep good boundaries, know your why, like why you're waiting, make sure you're really clear about that. Maybe sign a covenant with God, which I've done many times, I don't know if you know what that is, but I actually wrote it out where I make a covenant with God not to look lustfully at a woman. So that for me, that was like when I was trying to get like masturbation or porn out of my life, I actually signed something that said, I'm not going to look at a woman lustfully for 30 days or whatever it was. And if I don't, I said, if I keep this covenant, God, open doors for me that no man can shut. Because I wanted them to bless me and my business or my nonprofit because I was struggling. And I said, but if I don't keep it, I want you to punish me severely and fight against me with the sword of your mouth, Jesus. And it's terrifying when you sign it because you're asking God to punish you. And it was an article I read, and they kind of provided the gas and the brake, because you get the gas because you want the blessing, the brake because you fear the punishment. And it worked, definitely helped me get through some times where I probably would have, where I was just feeling bad, and sometimes rubbing one out made me feel a little better. It was kind of like my escape, and but that covenant really helped me. So that's something that I recommend to guys. But I think if you know your why, for me, I have a platform, so it's a little bit easier because I wrote the book, so that definitely keeps me out of a lot of trouble. But those would be my biggest tips. That's what at least has worked for me.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. A lot of guys.
This might
be hear that stuff.
This might be relevant. Maybe not biblically Christian, but prostate health as you get older, not masturbating, not having sex. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, dude, I love that you brought that up. It just made me remember something. So like sex transmutation is something I talk about in the book, and that was something from Think and Grow Rich. You know what that is?
No.
So it's basically like harnessing your sexual energy. It's the most powerful energy in the world is your sexual energy, and
like Taoism, kind of
like NoFap almost, where you don't ejaculate, and what you do is you use that sexual energy to accomplish things. And people have done this throughout history, apparently, like built empires, using their sexual energy. And I really think that actually goes back to God's original design with Adam and Eve, because God, a lot of people think Eve was made at the same time as Adam, and she wasn't. Adam was made first, and Adam didn't get a woman; he got a job, right? Adam's purpose, he's like, go name the animals, tend to the garden. Eve came along later, and I really think that's what God wants for every man is purpose before person. So what you do is you harness that sexual energy, you use it to figure out what the hell you're here for, and then get started, and then find the person right after and pull them in. Because I love what John Etheridge says in Wild at Heart. He says every woman wants to play a part in a great adventure. So your job as a man is to bring that woman into a great adventure. Give her something to do. Take her on an adventure. Most guys don't do that. Most guys choose their person before they know their purpose, and they never figure out their purpose because they never harness their sexual energy long enough, and then they just watch football and drink beer on the weekends to escape that gnawing feeling inside that they know they're supposed to do something, but they can't really figure out what it was. You know what I mean? Like that, I think, is common. They say men live lives of quiet desperation. And I really feel like that's wise because we don't want to wait. So I think that is the right path. And I know if I look at my life, when I was out pouring around, I didn't know what the hell I was here for. It was only when I stopped, I got obedient to God. I started meeting with a life coach. And then God revealed all these amazing things. And now if I bring a woman into my life, or when I bring a woman, or potentially women, kidding, maybe, then I will be able to take her on something pretty amazing. But if God would have given me a wife 12 years ago, I want to know what to do with her. Like I probably just would have got a bullshit job and like just a very normal, very bland life. So I think that harness that sexual energy, use it to figure out why you're here, get it started, because it's going to take some oomph. You're going to have to work late. You might not have time for a girlfriend or a wife at first. You might not have the money for a wife or girlfriend. Get your purpose, your mission started, and then bring her into it. And on top of that, don't have sex with her, because that's going to allow you to do is think with a clear head, because sex will cloud it, period. It definitely will. If you're thinking like, I need a wife, and then you're looking for the helpmate to accomplish the thing that you already know you're supposed to do, and then you can pick the right girl. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe it involves traveling, and you got a girl that doesn't like to travel. Okay, on to the next one. So I think that's the right order. Yeah,
makes sense. And I think as far as like boundaries and stuff too, like I think you got to be upfront pretty early with women on your abstinence views, because I think she needs to be on the team with you on that. Because if she's going to tempt you later, like I think we're all weak as men, so she also needs to be part of that barrier with her own convictions, because otherwise I don't think it's going to work out long term.
Yeah, it's good.
Which that's a rare girl to find. Like I've had that conversation numerous times with Christian women, and it's one that doesn't go over well.
That you're waiting?
Yeah. Like, so my experience, I think, has been, and we were talking about this kind of offline, is Christian women that have had a lot of experience, they have this, I think, plague in the back of their mind about sexual compatibility because of bad partners. So when you really get their honest view on it, they don't really want to wait.
Yeah.
And at least that's been my experience. Obviously, I'm not painting the brush on all of them.
They want that test ride. And curious, you've been with, how does that work out to you now? Thinking about, because you've already had all the sex, so kind of the way people might. You can kind of look at a car and be like, that thing's gonna ride like a box truck, or like, hey, maybe that's gonna have a night, Anyways, that's what the fear you're talking about, right?
Well, it's what it's what I've noticed in women, because they obviously the man's in the leadership role, so they're kind of they've had some bad experiences and they're worried about that.
Yeah, I think I wonder what they think actually, because they've never really told me, but I've definitely felt what you're talking about. I wonder if it's like they think maybe you have a crooked penis, or like you're small, or whatever it is they think. But I guess I have to think like, look at like someone like Tim Tebow, right? To me, he's a real man. Like everybody knew that guy could get laid. Like anytime he won, he could have smashed anything he wanted. Tebow, yeah, and he chose the weight. So it's like I feel like if you elevate your masculinity enough, that it should be apparent that the reason that you're waiting, you know what I'm saying? Like I don't think anybody questions Tim Tebow's masculinity, or it hurt him. Like he could have still dated and probably married anybody he wanted, but he raised himself, his status to the point where it wasn't a question. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. He's got standards that aren't being qualified by the world. He has his own standards. That's awesome. Being able to stand out like that. You see that with art. The greatest artists writing on the periphery. You're not going to fall in with the crowd. Takes, those women want something that's like it's a general article. They don't want something that it's sad. It's part of that cesspool.
I think if you got the status, you can get away with it a little bit more. Like, because obviously most chicks are like, well, no dude's gonna actually wait till marriage unless it's like not his choice. So like the average guy is the average Christian man is put in a little bit of a difficult spot because like of the cultural assumption that men have no interest in waiting. So it's just kind of, I think the assumed in, then it's like, well, why don't girls want you?
Right. Well, those aren't the girls that are going to respect the covenant anyway.
Yeah.
It's just slim pickings out there. I read this Bible. I was reading Exodus. And in Exodus, there's a verse where Moses says, if you lend money to a poor person, you cannot collect interest. And it was one of those things that I kind of read and was like, wow, that's interesting. First of all, how do you define a poor person? What is a poor person? And then what is interest, right? And I'm kind of thinking to myself, like, well, we all inherently know who's rich and poor. Like, there's really rich people out there, right? And then there's poor people, which is most of the Pareto effect means that, there's that 1%, and then there's the rest of us. And I'm thinking to myself, like, there's another one of those little Bible verses that I don't think many people are actually putting into practice,
The Jews being the bankers too.
I
Is
was-
that what does that have to do with this?
It's really just about cherry picking in the Bible and kind of like us like looking at things and sort of wondering like who is rich, who is poor, and like how we can kind of hide behind legalism sometimes too. And I feel like we're doing this so much in the church nowadays within like the way that we see what it is, what the church is and what our agency is in the body of Christ and being excited about it. I really want to see us as men be excited about working out the kingdom vision for Christ on earth. And I see us being beaten down by society a lot, like we're talking right now, like with the divorce and the slim pickings and like, all these things which are
Well, at least
true.
we're not getting killed and hung up on crosses
Dude,
upside
there's
down.
tons of other things that
You could say that the church was flourishing more when that was
Nero
going down.
maybe.
Yeah,
Versus-
Roma's got nuked to the ground though during that time.
But it
Well,
makes
at least the believers that were doing it were doing it. I mean, how many people are on fire the way those guys were? I mean,
It really
those guys
makes
are
you
ready
wanna-
to get crucified upside down. It's like the wheelbarrow. How many of them are willing to
Well,
get in a
they
wheelbarrow?
also saw Jesus directly. So
Most of them didn't. Most of them did not. I mean, you got those guys, but most of those guys in Rome, they did not. No. But I have a question. I kind of had a thought come up, like a hypothetical about the whole polygamy thing. And so like your motivation for getting a second wife, what would that look like? Under what circumstances would the church say that's okay? You can go find your second wife, buddy. If I was in a sort of like pastoral position, hypothetically, in a weird world, and you got Tommy coming up, he's like, you know what? I feel like it's time for a second wife. Be like, all right, let's talk about your first wife here for a second. What makes sense to me is that Tommy would have to have the best relationship with his wife. His wife and him would be like totally unified, like the poster child of a good marriage, right? In order for him to say, yeah, I need a second wife, because he had to prove. He'd be like, okay, you have one wife. So you have to prove to me that with your first wife, you were good enough. But then it kind of defeats itself because it's like, well, if stuff's so good with your wife, then why do you want a second wife?
I think it would go the
Because
other way. I think the woman would come requesting it to the pastor, like they do with the Jewish community.
Then that would never happen.
Not the woman that he's married to, but other women, the single women that don't have literally has no other options.
Do they really not? They live in Jerusalem. Like, did they want to marry a certain Jewish guy? I mean, they could go somewhere to find a husband. They have to be Jewish. That's the problem.
There you
They
go.
have to be Jewish.
Yep.
So that's definitely not the circumstance we live under.
Yeah, I mean, I think it couldn't be sanctioned by the government because that's illegal, right? But
The marriage shouldn't be anyway.
Yeah,
begin with.
it could be a commitment ceremony done by, in the eyes of God, and I think that's fine. Because when did the government even get involved in the marriages? I'm not sure when, but originally there was no ceremony with Adam and Eve, and probably there maybe hundreds if there even thousands of years. But like I go back, like I do see people going back to guys like Tate or whatever. Like there's this guy Justin Waller, his guy that follows him around. Now I've seen him on different podcasts, and he's got a Christian background from what I've heard. Take him. It's like he's looking at someone like Tate, and you're saying, okay, Tate's a bad example of who to follow. What's the alternative? The alternative is so far away from what that is. It's not like it's hard to get to. It's not hard to see why men are having a hard time accepting it. Go back to, I had this group called the Waiting Works Community on Facebook, 4,000 people in this Facebook group. Guess what? It's all about saving sex for marriage. Guess what percentage of them are women? Probably like 95. Very few men in there. I couldn't even
men
remember.
suck at they dropping the ball. I mean, look at our families. There's no cool kids being grown. There's no kids conditioning and indoctrinating their fellow students. You know, they're just little sponges that are. I mean, the I agree with Joe. The incarnation of Christ is largely dead. It's cheap grace everywhere you look. That's why I brought it up. And that's
Yeah.
why there's so many slim pickings. If you're an Amish young lad growing up in Amish town, but you got a few girls and you know the history of those girls and they know the history of you. And it makes sense because the church has been the one sanctioning marriage and overlooking it. But like, here's another hypothetical. Say, for instance, you got your 2 wives and you guys go out on a double. Well, it's always going to be a double date, right? Or triple date.
I think
know?
I think in practice it,
But
everything
listen,
was
so you're
separate.
sitting there, right? Yeah, separate. Then she doesn't know. I mean, so let's say you're taking both out, right?
Okay.
Beautiful sunset. Which one do you kiss first? What are you gonna do?
Triple kiss.
Or it's a cheers.
You gotta bring them all in the same
Triple kiss.
time.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
So then they're kissing each other. Is that lesbianness?
I'm pretty
They're
sure in
sisters.
the relation the
But
relations.
so it's sister for them, and then oh wow, that's a weird trifecta.
I'm stretching.
No, I see what you're trying to do, and that's what
I'm pretty sure there was no third party sex either. It was
pretty sure.
those
But
two-
it's just conjecture.
You're not
Well,
having threesomes.
no. I think that was out of bounds. It had to be separate. Like
I'm not saying threesome. I'm saying you kiss it at sunset. I mean, it's like all this. There's all these different hierarchies. First, last, blah 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 blah.
Yeah, it's going to be challenging. It's going
Better
to
hope they're
be
ovulating at different times of the month.
I mean, if you wanted a second wife, it would be because your first marriage sucked, which would kind of disqualify you from having a second wife. Because if she's not giving you sex, that means, I mean,
I think ultimately
what
like,
happened there? Is it because her bottom half got blown off in a suicide bombing? Like that's way different than the Western. Is she just doesn't want to put out? That means that she's not adhering to the Bible. She's not listening to what Paul said about, treating sex as you're deserved to your partner.
right.
It's like those are problems you should fix from a scripture point of view, not by having a second wife. You should fix those problems with doctrine. Unless she was like, terribly injured and she could not, and then you'd probably have those really conservative guys saying, well, you just got to tough it out, bro. That's not on the table for you anymore. Right. It's like,
I didn't think of that. It's kind of an interesting point.
I would say to those guys, show me biblically why it's not. Like for me, again, I was married to the idea monogamy. I was like, this is it. I'm gonna wait. Very few men will be that committed to actually go through what I went through, which is basically 18 years of the last 23 of abstinence. Like what men are going to do that in the world? And we're going to actually ask them to do that. Or we'll just say, well, just settle, bro. Just pick somebody. That's what I heard a lot. But then what would have happened is I would have known I settled it, and I would have been probably end up divorced. And I think that does happen. I think very few men want to be lonely, and they get married because it's time. And I got a friend that's in a marriage right now, a sexless marriage, and that woman, his wife, knows that she is his only outlet for sex, and she's big. Again, she also knows that him taking another wife isn't a possibility.
Is she a Christian? Does she believe in the Bible?
They are
Sounds like she does not.
They are Christians. I know.
Sounds like she's one of those feminized, like wearing the pants ladies that just is hell to be around. What does he look like? Is he overweight?
No, he's not a bad looking guy. He's actually in the military. Rollo said something in Rational Male. He said most women would rather, I don't remember the exact quote, but something along the lines of most women would rather have a strong alpha man that they have to share than have like a beta man or a weak man to themselves. I think that's 100% true. And I think that the reason that and this is a stat, maybe you guys have talked about this, I don't know, but 80% of the women are sleeping with 20% of the men right now. You know about that?
Yeah, that's the assumed from
Right.
dating apps.
Okay, maybe it's not exactly that, but it's probably pretty close. So that tells you right there that is true. 80% of the women are sleeping with the alphas. And they know that they're probably not their only one. It's a cesspool. Now imagine if this was okay. Just hypothetically, imagine if it was. Of those 20% of the men, some of them probably wouldn't mind being right with God, wouldn't mind knowing that they're not, fornicating or sinning, especially if they're Christians. I would imagine. Would that, wouldn't that help? I mean, the
Maybe a
women are
very
already,
small
the women are already
percentage.
doing it. I mean,
Dude,
they're-
if guys can't even handle one marriage and you're talking to guys with sexless marriage, like it just they don't have. It's like sending a 5-year-old into a special ops mission. It's like, okay, dude, you know how to work a squirt gun. This is kind of similar, but you're just gonna blow people's heads off instead of squirting them down. So it's like they can't handle marriage. What the hell is 2 marriages gonna do? Like that real estate agent, the redhead dude with the goatee, who's always trying to flirt with the hostesses and shit. What's his name? Justin Waller.
Yeah.
That guy. Like, I'm sorry. I look at him describe his relationships and I'm like, you're very guarded and it doesn't sound like you love your wives. I've heard guys who talk about their wives and
He doesn't have any wives.
Well, I mean, his mates, whatever, like, his family organism that he's created. I know what authentic love sounds like when I hear a mate talking about their mate. I've heard it. And it just rings like a bell. You're like, that makes sense. And I've seen it and I hear it and I can feel it coming off of both of you guys. I didn't see that with him, and I just don't see how polygamy could work in a society where one-on-one marriages aren't working.
well,
You know what's
I mean,
interesting? Yeah, sorry.
what
Keep
percentage of the population has that love that you're mentioning? Because I've seen that too, but it's so rare. But I would say, like, when we say things like that, I just don't see how it could work. I think what we're saying is that we think we know more than God, because God, if maybe we don't have to live the way that God outlined in the Old Testament, year of Jubilee, and
Be pretty cool if we did.
it would be cool, right? That gives you a pretty good idea of how God thinks the society should work. And he definitely talks about polygamy. And he says, if your brother's wife dies, marry her. You have to marry her. And if you don't, you're a disgrace to your family. So, like, not saying we have to do those things, but God outlines it. And to me, that's his idea of how society should run.
Well, I also look at the implicit nature of that. Like, again, like, marry her or look after her. Make sure she's okay.
Right.
Make sure, like, take
'Cause
care
back
of the
then,
widows.
She would be screwed.
Yeah. So we're living in and again, like, I look at the things that aren't explicitly said aren't sin, like tons of these things. Wow. There's tons of them. Stuff that's sacrificed to idols,
And Jordan
all of a
Peterson
sudden-
says polygamous societies in human history have been the most violent societies.
Well, look at the Muslims. I mean, it's pretty. I mean, a lot of fear there. No grace, no mercy. Wow.
I was
Excommunication, no grace for your family members. They don't believe the same thing you do.
Look at the Mormons. They're not. There's no suicide bombers that are Mormons.
But there's not many. I heard there's not
polygamy
really.
there.
There's not
It's
a lot
like
of them.
But I'm just saying they're not violent
ostracized.
people. They're not
It's like
violent.
the Charlie Manson Mormons that do it, like
I
the
don't think we
weird
can-
ones.
I don't
Not
think
a lot
we
of.
can equate polygamy with violence. Is all the point I'm trying to make. But
I
yeah,
think it's at a society a whole level because what happens is, and this is from Jordan Peterson more so, is when men at a large portion of the population don't have access to any women because most of them are with those other men, they start getting violent. And I think today why we don't
They hungry. They got.
we don't
that
have
hangry.
I think today why we're not already seeing that is because they're sedated by video games, porn, and weed.
And
Yeah.
now red pill has become another sedation.
Kind of.
It's another one.
We'll just watch Fresh and Fit all day and get
yeah,
mad at
let's
women.
get sedated in our hate rage.
in Feudal, I was reading I've read The Prince a couple times, and I thought one passage that stands out is when Machiavelli is talking about they used to, in the feudal times, they had, now this wasn't always practiced, but it did happen often enough for him to make a point of this, is that when people were getting married, the king would often sleep with the wife first.
Yeah, what's it called?
Oh God, it's in
He would
Braveheart's the worst part of the movie.
Yeah.
He's like, you know
What's the
what,
term of
dude?
that
If
again?
you cannot do
So
this,
bad.
don't do this, because
Could
you
you-
will
oh,
piss
man.
off all the guys, and eventually they're gonna come for you.
Oh yeah.
So that's of course an extreme example of polygamy, and
I wouldn't even
the
say
way
it's
that
polygamy because they're not marrying them.
not
are they?
really.
They're just
Exactly.
spoiling your
just
pride.
raping.
Oh,
It's
my
or
word.
graping. Sorry.
It's not really, but these were kings, and a lot of them were Christian kings, and they, of course, it's not a sin. So what's the big deal here? But
well, that
I
was
think, yeah.
another man's wife, right? So,
Well, she's not quite his wife yet.
oh right, yeah.
That's the idea, is that he sleeps with her before they get
It's
married.
like no virgins are there.
No, you don't get a virgin. But I think it really comes down to sex being the motivator and a man's desire. And you know, I can see it at your age. You're like, you know, I don't, how am I going to meet a wife? And I'm questioning this because
Sure.
I think about like what makes a relationship important. We think about like beautiful women, age, of course, it's going to go away eventually. No matter how beautiful she is, she's going to deteriorate. So are we. And then you think about like shared experiences, like what you do with your best friends. Like my brother and I, on the way up to Mike's house today in the truck, we brought up some memories. You know, we would talk about things that we did in the past, little stories, and kind of reminisce about our journey. And sort of that is highly enjoyable, you know, because you remember a piece of your character, and then you remember a piece of their character, and the story, and this person, and this sort of miracle of life that God blesses
It's like a
us
ping
with.
pong game that you
It's
guys kind of
gorgeous.
both. Yeah, it's awesome.
And like if you don't, and that's why I think marrying it or meeting somebody at an early age,
Yeah.
and investing in them is so important, because like once you get older, it's just like, how are they going to get to know, you know, all this person that you have and share these stories?
Well, it's funny because people
How do
often
you
use that.
even open up?
People often use that in the
to be
reverse. They're
vulnerable.
like, you know everything about him. There's nothing more you can know. How boring. Sounds horrible. You guys just bored together. Roommates. Ugh. You know, and it's like, well, it's actually really nice because they help you keep your sanity. They help you to remind you of who you are in your hard times. You share stories together. You share consciousness. You become one flesh. You're embedded in each other.
And you hear stories about these women that turn 40 years old and they get on the desperate housewife craze, and they're like, you know, the grass is greener on the other side. And then they realize that it wasn't.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't all that was chalked up to be. And they wish they never did that. And I think that's the common rule with sin. You know, it's like it's very enticing. It's deceivingly enticing. You're like, man, it sure does look good over there. And we forget.
But coming back to love, I read Gandhi's autobiography. It's a weird book, man. Gandhi is not the guy you think he is. He's definitely more severe than you think he is. He's incredibly severe, man. He took oaths in his life and kept them, even if it meant like he was gonna die. And I remember thinking about that severity in it. And he had a wife, right? He got this arranged marriage when he was young, and he was like, knew that she did not understand him at all. Like, she is the different kind of person. Like, Gandhi's very thoughtful, very well educated, and she was a commoner, you know, and he could not connect with her. And he describes like finding love with her, loving her despite that disconnection, and not having a condescension with her, and just being like, you know, she's wise in her own ways, kind of like George Orwell with like the common people, the proletariat, the wisdom of the proletariat. And I was thinking about love, because like when I was younger, I'd have girlfriends, and I wouldn't say it was very easy for me to fall in love, because I thought it was infatuation. Like, you don't understand what love truly is. You just know that you can't stop thinking about somebody, and you're like, oh, that's love. Like, I have no control over my thoughts, and this person is just inhabiting my brain and heart. But then I think love, now that I've been married for almost 5 years now, and I think that it has a lot to do with commitment and devotion. You know, it's kind of like the sword going into the fire, sharpening it, shaving it. Like, you find love with the people. I mean, God made it so that you were attracted to the person, and, you know, all those things, but you get more in love with your wife as you overcome the issues that you're faced with. If that's communication, you know, any of those things, you do that together.
Have you heard of
So I think that I don't really believe in the soulmate thing. I think that there's a hubris that starts up with men who've been looking for a long time, because I was one of them. And it's like, she needs to be this or that, and we kind of don't know what's exactly good for us, and we don't know what love really feels like, or when love actually roots in, because you're like, am I in love with her after 3 months? Or it's been a week, or, you know, it's been a year, and I don't feel that same honeymoon. Like, there's all these weird qualifying gymnastics we put ourselves through, which suck. And it's like, well, if you're devoted, I like Jordan Peterson said, it's like you're locked in the room with them. So just be that way. and then you'll fall and you'll discover love.
I think
together.
one thing to remember about the Old Testament is they weren't marrying for love. It was like, here you
A
go.
lot of times, yeah.
And the women were kind of basically a piece of like a property. Like,
Yeah.
Well, that's Old Testament, right?
yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's the, if we're looking at a template of what it used to be, like our idea of marrying for romantic love is literally within the last 200 years.
Well, I
of
think
humans.
romantic love, you saw with Gandhi, you see it happen a lot where they didn't really love their wives at first. They felt like it was, and he said to his father, he's like, this sucks, like, and his dad's like, too bad, buddy. And he found love with her, and I think that God gave us a romantic thing. Like it's meant to be there. It's an instinct we have, so that's just, love's a tough thing to distinguish. And there may be a woman that would make you really happy that you would kind of not, it wouldn't be your first pick,
Yeah.
I do hear what you're saying about love being a choice. I've heard a lot of people say that. I mean, it starts off with a feeling, right? Because if it was just a choice, then you could just go choose to marry the next girl that you meet and just make it work, right? So it's got to start with a feeling and then become a choice, because then once you're in it, the feeling goes away, you're in it. But like I got good discernment, man. Like I know when God's leading me to do a thing or not. And I either thought one of the two things is going to happen. I'm going to meet a girl that I just feel so, fall so head over heels for. I'm going to be like, please, God, is this her? Please say yes. Or I'm going to meet somebody and he's going to say her. And I'll be like, oh, okay. All right. And I would have married her. Like either way, I was good. Because I mean, if I wasn't that committed to God, I would have never done what I did. I mean, being alone that long sucked. So I was good. And I do hear God's voice, and he didn't lead me to either. And I can't help but think that there are other men out there that are maybe in a similar situation, and they're not handling maybe the exact same way. Maybe they're just, having sex with different girls and feeling guilty about it, asking for forgiveness, or probably a variety of ways that it could go. But yeah, I mean, I'm on a dating app, and man, it's a cesspool. I'll tell you, like, there's so many weird relationships structures out there now. Non-monogamy, polyamory, all kinds of stuff. And for me, I'm like, I need to see what the Bible says. And to me, it's pretty clear. There are certain things that are accepted and not accepted. And from what I could see, that, polygamy is one of the things that God was okay with. Not polyamory, not, unfortunately, for some people, homosexuality, and I feel like most churches would probably be more likely to fly a rainbow flag out front of their church than they would be to accept polygamy, even though one is clearly in the Bible and one is not at least explicitly stated. Whether you agree it's right or wrong, it's not said. And that's kind of sad, like that's the state that we're in. That's how, like twisted things are. But yeah, I don't know, man. I'm still wrestling with it. Hopefully,
we're all wrestling with it, man. That's what our job is to do: is sharpen each other's iron.
Yeah.
God wrestled with Jacob.
Wrestlers
with God. Yeah.
Hey, Joe and I are in the same boat. We're looking too. It's a challenge.
It can get very lonely and depressing, and I really enjoyed talking to you about it today, brother, and just your avant-gardeness about your struggles. Because, man, does that do all? That's the fellowship right there. It does a world of good for all of us to help bolster each other and feel like, yeah, you're badass, brother. Like, yes, we're excited about this. And I think we need to do more of that for each other, because just having this conversation has edified me greatly. Me brother. Too, man. I really appreciate it, Rob. Yeah. Thank you, man.
You guys are studs, man. Seriously.
Likewise.
I'm looking at you two single guys, man. I'm like, seriously, to look the way you guys do and be holding the line the way you are, man, that's really inspiring and really impressive. You're real men of God. And that, I take my hat off to you. So.
Man, all glory to God. All three of you guys. I can say that from the one married man in the room here. Yeah, all three of you guys, man.
I only didn't include you because you're married. I mean,
no, I get it. And
you're a handsome man too. So
no, well, for you three, I can say the same thing, and
copy and paste.
And I can say, I think it's really encouraging for the women out there to see guys like you, and hear your guys' self-restraint and know there's nothing wrong with that, and see some men that are really putting their Bible where their actions are, man.
Yeah, for sure.
It's good.
Yeah, and we'll just keep preaching the message, even though it's really against culture, and that's what we're called to do.
Mm-hmm. But let's keep fellowshipping, brother. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Yeah,
Thanks for
Because I was in a relationship for 12 years and I'm like, just got to the 2-year mark, like of being single. And, you know, I haven't been perfect throughout that 2 years. I was used to having sex not every day, but regularly, you
Sure.
know, like masturbating was not a part of I hated it. Like I was not a jacker. I was an effer, you know,
Right.
like I don't even know what that is, dude. So it's been I don't know, like it's like going back to being like 17 because you haven't dated.
Yeah.
And then going into a brand new world and being like, wow, I literally have no idea what I mean, I'm
You're
used to
in the
having a
cesspool.
wife. You know what I mean? I'm used to
Yeah.
treating women like a wife and then looking at any other woman as like
Sister.
as a sister.
Yeah.
So like going out into the world and even just like having that sexual desire and like understanding what it is has been very confusing to integrate again, like into the dating and like how to deal with it. And so I appreciate talking to you and being mentored a little bit on your experience today because it's definitely new territory for me.
I know a lot of guys are going to get that same feeling because it is it can be lonely, but hearing these stories about men facing the loneliness like Paul did on his many roads, trying to spread the gospel. He was cold, his feet hurt, his knees were swollen. Elijah, you know, all the prophets, like, here's a great message God's going to give me, and no one's going to listen to it. There's a lot of loneliness in our walk, you know, but God is meant to fill us, and we're meant to be excited with our fellowship.
Amen.
We're meant to sharpen each other's iron. We're meant to feel like Paul says, do not be slothful with your zealousness, you know, and this is how we get it up. This is how we get it going.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I
Indeed.
agree. Well said.
Awesome. Well, Rob, where can the listeners find you?
Sure. Yeah, you can find me on social media. Most of the major channels, platforms. It's at Rob Kowalski. Just like I think it says. I typed my name in here. Yeah, Rob Kowalski.
Yeah, we got it in the description too, guys.
Yeah, and then if there's guys out there, I started a Facebook group called Unplugged Christian Alphas on Facebook, and you can just type that in. It's free to join. There's only about 100 guys in there right now, but we just started, and this is how I discovered you guys. Actually, love for you guys to join and come. Maybe we'll even do some lives or something in there. But you know, the idea is really just trying to help Christian men, you know, walk in masculine excellence, and hopefully ultimately,
about that.
yeah, change the way the world sees Christianity. I feel like, you know, we're on the decline a little bit. Like
that's been our goal with the podcast, to show like, hey, men can be jacked. They're like not all Christian men are these feminine kind of doormats. Like,
right.
We want to glamorize the discipleship and
Yes.
the submission to Christ. How awesome it is. It's awesome.
Yeah, man. So join the group, and this was a real pleasure. I'm going to introduce you guys to Rich Cooper too. Maybe it'd be fun to have on. I don't know if you want to have him. You have Rolo, so maybe.
Yeah, I like. I listen to a lot of Rich's content. I view him like kind of one of the more reasonable manosphere guys.
Yeah.
Like, I know he kind of doesn't associate with the manosphere anymore, but I do appreciate his views. And,
thanks for
we'll win him over to Christ one day.
Oh, really? Oh.
That's always the plan.
I didn't know he wasn't a believer.
It's always.
I assume, like, I'm assuming he's not.
No.
I would assume not.
Yeah.
But
Elliot Hulse would be a great guest for you guys.
I don't know. Do I know Elliot?
Oh, dude, you guys got to check Elliot.
See that blue-eyed black guy?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah,
Oh,
okay,
yeah,
I
I know
remember him,
Elliot. Yeah, for sure. I followed him way back in the day when he was doing like those home workout vids.
He's a real devoted Catholic now, and he's doing a lot of what you guys are doing and trying to help men, you know, embrace marriage as a goal and get strong and all that. So he'd be good to have on. I might be able to think of some others. Frank Rich, maybe he helps men get free from porn. Big ex-bodybuilder guy. I got a couple people I could hook you guys up with, but man, I really let me talk. I mean, I know the conversation probably took a little bit of a turn that you didn't expect, but I was
no. Specifically, I actually wanted to comment on that. I appreciate that because we as men need to experience. I'm not going to call it confrontation because that's too strong of a word. But what it is study together in real time. We're exchanging thoughts. I'm not, you know, it's a beautiful thing for men. That's how we get strong. It's how bonds are actually reinforced. And it's so hard to do that with guests sometimes without just like that little shifty weirdness. And then people shut down or let's not talk about that. And that's the problem in the church, man. Nothing's going to be talked about. Solutions aren't going to be found if we do that. So I appreciate your openness for that. Pushing back, playing some ball here. That's what we need to do.
Awesome.
Exactly.
Thank you, guys.
100%.
Awesome. Well, till next time, everyone. I guess next week, I think we maybe have Rachel Wilson, or maybe I think it's a week after, but we'll We'll keep you posted. Thanks.
Right on. Thanks, folks. Blessings to you, dear brother.